good evening, or maybe it's late at night where you are. Either way, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to say something personal. I'm just getting started as a horror narrator. This might be one of my first stories, actually, so if I make a mistake, or if my voice cracks a little, I hope you'll forgive me. I'm still finding my rhythm, and you're part of that journey. Now, if you enjoy creepy tales whispered in the dark, please do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like right now. Before you forget, or before something makes you forget. Some say it's just tiredness. Others know better. And one more thing. Where are you watching from? Which country? Which city? And what time is it for you? I'm genuinely curious. It helps me understand who's listening, who's brave enough to press play when the world is silent. So, shall we begin? The story I'm about to tell isn't mine, but tonight, I'll be the voice that carries it to you. And even if I'm new, the darkness doesn't care. It finds us all the same. There's something oddly comforting about the rain, isn't there? The gentle patter against your window pane, the rhythmic drumming on rooftops, the way it washes the world clean. I've always found solace in rainy nights, until last autumn, when the rain brought something else entirely. I want to share what happened to me, though I'm not sure you'll believe it. I'm not sure I believe in myself some days. But on nights when the rain falls heavy, I know it wasn't just my imagination. It began in late October. I'd recently moved to a small cottage on the outskirts of Blackmore Village, a quaint little place nestled in the rolling countryside of Devon. The cottage was over 200 years old with thick stone walls and small windows that rattled when the wind blew too hard. It was isolated, a good 15-minute drive to the village proper. But that's precisely what I wanted after years in London. My work as a freelance editor meant I could live anywhere with a decent internet connection. The solitude would be good for me, I thought. A chance to reset after my divorce. The first few weeks were peaceful. I'd wake early, work through the day, and spend my evenings reading by the fire or taking walks through the surrounding woods. Then the autumn rains came. It was a Friday night when I first heard it. The rain had been falling steadily since noon, a proper downpour that drummed against the roof and streamed down the windows in rivulets. I'd made myself a cup of tea and settled into my armchair with a book when I heard what sounded like a voice among the rainfall. At first, I thought it was just the wind or perhaps the old pipes groaning. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A whisper, barely audible beneath the rain. Hello. I set my book down and listened intently. Nothing but the rain for several minutes. I was about to return to my reading when I heard it again. Can you hear me? The voice was faint, like someone whispering from another room. I stood up and checked the cottage. All the windows were closed, the doors locked. I was utterly alone. Yet the voice persisted, now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Please, I need help. It was a woman's voice, I realized, soft and tinged with what sounded like desperation. I returned to the living room and spoke aloud to the empty space. Who's there? My voice sounded strange in the quiet cottage. The rain continued to fall, and for a long moment, there was no response. Then, so quiet I nearly missed it. I'm trapped. A chill ran down my spine. I approached the nearest window, peering out into the darkness. The rain distorted my view, transforming the garden into a blur of shadows. Was someone out there? Where are you? I called out, louder this time. Do you need me to call someone? No one can help me now. The voice seemed to be coming from the rain itself, each droplet carrying a fragment of her words. But you can hear me. That's unusual. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. I was tired. That's all. Working too much, sleeping too little. My mind was playing tricks on me. You're not imagining this, the voice said, as if reading my thoughts. I know how it sounds, but please don't stop listening. I sank back into my armchair, suddenly feeling very cold despite the fire blazing the hearth. Who are you? I asked. My name is Eleanor. The voice seemed stronger now, more distinct among the raindrops. Eleanor Blackwood. I lived in this cottage a long time ago. That's impossible, I whispered. A soft laugh rippled through the rain. Many things that seem impossible are merely unexplained. I've been trying to reach someone for so long. The others who lived here, they couldn't hear me, but you can. I sat perfectly still, listening to the impossible voice speaking through the rain. Part of me wanted to flee the cottage immediately, to dismiss this as an elaborate hallucination. But something in her voice, profound loneliness, kept me rooted to my seat. How are you speaking to me? I finally asked. Through the rain, Eleanor replied. It's the only way I can reach across. When it rains heavily like tonight, the boundary between where I am and where you are becomes thin, permeable. And where exactly are you? A long pause followed, filled only with the sound of raindrops. I don't know how to describe it, she finally said. It's like being trapped in the in-between. Not alive, but not gone either. Caught in the echoes of this place. You're saying you're a ghost? The word felt ridiculous leaving my mouth. I suppose that's one way to put it. Her voice carried a hint of sadness, though I don't feel like what I imagine ghosts would feel like. I'm not floating through walls or rattling chains. I'm just here, watching, remembering. How long have you been here? Since 1887. The reply came matter-of-factly. November 17th, to be precise. I felt a shiver run through me despite the warmth of the fire. What happened to you? The rain intensified, drumming harder against the windows. Eleanor's voice seemed to strengthen with it. I died in this cottage, she said simply. But that's not why I'm trapped. It's what happened before I died that keeps me here. I found myself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite my disbelief. What happened? It's a long tale, Eleanor whispered. Are you certain you want to hear it? Once I begin, there's no unknowing it. And knowledge can be dangerous. I should have said no, should have walked away, packed my things, and left the cottage that very night. But curiosity has always been my downfall. Tell me, I said. The rain seemed to pause for a moment, as if gathering itself, before resuming with renewed intensity. And through the rainfall, Eleanor began her story. I came to this cottage in the spring of 1883. I was 22 years old and recently widowed. My husband, Thomas, had been a solicitor in Exeter. When he died suddenly of pneumonia, I found myself without means or family to support me. This cottage belonged to a distant cousin who offered it to me as a place to live out my days in what he called respectable poverty. The rain softened slightly, and Eleanor's voice took on a wistful quality. It was beautiful then. The garden was full of wildflowers, and the woods were teeming with life. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt I could breathe again. I kept to myself mostly. The villagers were suspicious of a young woman living alone, but they left me be. I grew my own vegetables, kept chickens, and sold herbal remedies to make ends meet. Her voice darkened. Then he arrived. Jonathan Blackwood. No relation to me, despite the shared name. He'd purchased a manor house on the hill and all the surrounding land, including the woods behind this cottage. He was from London, wealthy beyond measure from investments in railways and factories, the sort of man accustomed to taking whatever he wanted. I glanced towards the window, picturing the hill beyond the trees where now only ruins remained of what locals called the Old Manor. Jonathan took an interest in me from the moment he saw me gathering herbs in the woods. At first, he was charming, bringing gifts, offering assistance with repairs to the cottage. I was flattered by his attention, I admit, but soon his true nature revealed itself. The rain beat harder against the windows, as if agitated by the memory. He became possessive, demanding. When I refused his advances, he grew angry, threatened to evict me, claiming his purchase of the land included my cottage. It didn't, of course. I checked the deed myself. But who would take the word of a poor widow over that of a wealthy gentleman? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I began to avoid him, but living so isolated made it difficult. One night in late summer, he came to the cottage, drunk and violent. Her voice faltered. Well, suffice to say, he took what I wouldn't give freely. When he finished, he told me I should be grateful for his attention. My stomach churned at the implication. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "It was a different time," Eleanor continued, her voice hollow. Such crimes were rarely spoken of, let alone punished, especially when committed by men of his standing. I had no recourse, no justice available to me. The rain seemed to whisper along with her now, millions of droplets carrying fragments of her story. After that night, something changed in me. The fear and shame gave way to a cold, calculated rage. I began to study the old books my grandmother had left me, books of folk magic and herbal lore that I previously dismissed as superstition. The fire in my heart flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. "There's power in these woods," Eleanor whispered. "Ancient power that sleeps beneath the roots and stones." I learned to tap into it, just a little, enough for what I needed to do. "What did you do?" I asked, hardly breathing. "I curse him," she said simply. "A slow, insidious curse that would make him waste away, body and mind." I brewed a tincture of herbs gathered under the dark moon and added 3 drops of my blood. Then I found my way into the manor house and slipped it into his evening brandy. The rain pattered against the roof in a rhythm that almost sounded like applause. It worked better than I could have imagined. Within weeks, he was bedridden, plagued by fevers and hallucinations. The doctors were baffled. Nothing they tried could stop his decline. By autumn, he was a shell of the man he had been. Her voice carried a note of grim satisfaction that sent a shiver down my spine. But I underestimated him, even in his weakened state. His mind remained sharp enough to suspect me on a rainy night much like this one. He dragged himself from his sickbed and came to the cottage with a hunting knife. I glanced involuntarily at the floorboards beneath my feet. We struggled, Eleanor continued. In his condition, I might have overpowered him, but he caught me by surprise. The knife found my heart. As I lay dying on these very floorboards, he collapsed beside me, the last of his strength spent. We died together, enemies locked in a final embrace. The rain seemed to whisper her last words, each droplet carrying a fragment of her voice. But death wasn't the end for either of us. The curse I cast had unintended consequences. It bound us together, our spirits tethered to this place. Jonathan is here too, trapped as I am. My blood ran cold. Here? In the cottage? Not in the same way I am. Eleanor said quickly, "He's elsewhere, a darker place." But when the rain falls heavily, the boundaries weaken. He searches for me, even now, seeking revenge for what I did to him. As if in response to her words, the rain suddenly hammered against the windows with renewed ferocity. The lights flickered briefly, and I could have sworn I heard something scratch at the door. "He can't harm you," Eleanor assured me, though her voice had grown urgent. "Not directly, but he can influence things, subtle manipulations of the physical world, and he can whisper thoughts into your mind if you let him in." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my mouth dry with fear. "Because you can help me," she said simply. "After nearly a century and a half of being trapped, I've learned there's a way to break this curse, to free both of us, though Jonathan doesn't deserve freedom." "How?" "There's a box buried beneath the old oak at the edge of the garden. Inside is my grandmother's book of remedies and rituals, the one I used to create the curse. I need you to find it and perform a ritual of unbinding during the next new moon." I hesitated. This was madness. I was sitting in my cottage having a conversation with Rain, planning to dig up a century-old box based on a ghost story. "I know how this sounds," Eleanor said, reading my thoughts again, "but you hear me for a reason. Our paths have crossed across time for a purpose. Even if I wanted to help you," I began, "how do I know this isn't some elaborate trick? How do I know you're telling me the truth about what happened?" The rain softened to a gentle patter before Eleanor spoke again. "You don't," she admitted. "You have only my word. But consider this. If I meant you harm, why warn you about Jonathan? Why tell you how to break the curse that keeps me here?" It was a fair point, but something still troubled me. If I help free you, I'm also freeing him. "Yes," she sighed. "That's the cruel irony of the curse I created. We're bound together, neither able to move on without the other. But once free, he will have no power in your world. He'll face whatever judgment awaits him beyond." I sat in silence for a long moment, considering her request. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all an elaborate hallucination, perhaps brought on by the isolation of the cottage. But what if it wasn't? "I need time to think about this," I finally said. "Of course," Eleanor replied, "but don't take too long. The new moon is in 5 days. And be careful. Now that you've heard me, Jonathan will know. He'll try to reach you too." As if on cue, the rain suddenly changed its rhythm, becoming harsher, more insistent. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "He's coming," Eleanor whispered urgently. "I have to go. Remember, don't listen to his voice, no matter what he promises or threatens." "Wait," I began, but her presence was already fading, her voice growing fainter with each word. "When the rain comes again, I'll return. Please help me." And then she was gone, leaving only the sound of rain against the windows. But it wasn't the same soothing rhythm as before. Now it sounded angry, impatient, like fingers drumming on glass. I spent a restless night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cottage. By morning, the rain had stopped, and in the clear light of day, I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the entire conversation. Almost. The next 4 days passed without incident. No voices in the rain, no supernatural occurrences. I threw myself into my work, editing manuscripts with focus that bordered on obsessive. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to push away thought of Eleanor and her story. But I couldn't stop myself from investigating one detail. Using the local library's archives, I discovered that a Jonathan Blackwood had indeed purchased Blackmore Manor in 1883. Records showed he died in November 1887 after a lengthy, mysterious illness. The same day, a woman named Eleanor Wright, not Blackwood as she claimed, was found dead in a cottage on his estate property. The official report listed it as a murder-suicide, claiming Eleanor had poisoned Jonathan before taking her own life. This discovery shook me. Either I'd somehow absorbed this local history subconsciously, and my mind had woven it into an elaborate fantasy, or Eleanor had been telling the truth. On the fifth night, the new moon hung invisible in the sky, and the rain returned with vengeance. I sat in my living room, lights blazing against the darkness, waiting for hours. There was nothing but the sound of raindrops. Then, just as I was beginning to think she would return, I heard it. "You've been looking into my story." Eleanor's voice emerged from the rainfall, clearer than before. "Yes," I admitted. "I found records of you and Jonathan." "And what did these records tell you?" "That you poisoned him and then killed yourself." A sad laugh rippled through the rain. History is written by the survivors, and in the absence of survivors, by men who believe what other men tell them. "So you didn't kill yourself?" "No, that was Jonathan's final act, to ensure I would be remembered as mad and vengeful rather than as his victim." I nodded slowly. It made a terrible kind of sense. "Have you decided?" she asked. "Will you help me?" I hesitated only briefly before answering. "Yes, tell me what to do." Relief flooded her voice. "Thank you. First, you need to find the box. It's buried beneath the oak tree on the north side near the largest root. Now, in this downpour, it must be tonight, the new moon, and the rain. The rain will keep Jonathan distracted. He can't focus on both of us at once." Reluctantly, I pulled on my raincoat and boots and grabbed a torch and garden shovel. The rain hit me like a physical force as I stepped outside, drenching me within seconds despite my protection. The old oak stood at the edge of the garden, a massive sentinel that had likely witnessed centuries pass. Its gnarled roots spread out in all directions, creating natural hollows in the earth. I moved to the north side and began to dig near the largest root. The ground was soft from rain, making my task easier than expected. After about 2 feet, my shovel struck something solid. Kneeling in the mud, I brushed away the soil to reveal a small wooden box, its lid carved with intricate symbols that my torch couldn't quite illuminate clearly. "I found it," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if Eleanor could hear me outside. I carried the box back to the cottage, leaving puddles of rainwater and mud in my wake. Once inside, I placed it on the kitchen table and examined it properly. The wood was dark with age, but remarkably preserved. The symbols carved into the lid appeared to be a mixture of Celtic knots and what might have been runes. "Open it." Eleanor's voice came from the rainfall beating against the kitchen window. I hesitated. "Are you sure this is safe?" "It's just a book," she assured me. "It can't harm you unless you use it improperly." That wasn't entirely reassuring, but I carefully lifted the lid anyway. Inside, preserved in what appeared to be oilcloth, was a small leather-bound book. Its pages had yellowed with age, but the handwritten text remained legible. "The ritual is near the end," Eleanor instructed. "The unbinding spell." I flipped through the pages, finding myself drawn into the contents despite my purpose. The book contained not just spells and rituals, but detailed information about local plants and their properties, astronomical observations, and personal notes from Eleanor's grandmother. It was as much a scientific journal as a book of magic. Near the end, I found what Eleanor had described, a ritual titled To Unbind What Had Been Bound. I've found it, I told her. What now? You'll need to prepare a circle of salt around yourself for protection. Then light a candle made of beeswax. There should be one in the box beneath the book. Sure enough, when I lifted the book, I found a thick, yellow candle wrapped in the same oilcloth. Once the circle is cast and the candle lit, you'll need to read the ritual aloud. Exactly as written, Eleanor continued. As you do, focus your intent on breaking the bonds that hold me here. That's it. I asked skeptically. Magic isn't like in the stories, she said. It's about intent and will as much as words and gestures. The ritual provides structure, but your belief gives it power. I gathered the salt from my kitchen cupboard and created a circle around myself in the center of the living room. I placed a candle in front of me and lit it with trembling hands. The flame burned unusually bright, casting long shadows across the walls. I'm ready, I said, opening the book to the ritual page. Wait. Eleanor's voice had grown urgent. He knows what we're doing. He's trying to break through. As if in response to her warning, the rain suddenly changed its rhythm, becoming violent and angry. It hammered against the windows with such force I feared the glass might shatter. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath forming visible clouds in the air. Quickly, Eleanor urged, begin the ritual before he can stop you. I took a deep breath and began to read the words on the page. By moon's dark face and water's flow, I break the bonds forged long ago. What malice bound in blood and pain, I now unbind and make twain. The candle flame flickered wildly as I read, though there was no breeze in the room. The words seemed to hang in the air, visible for a moment like smoke before dissipating. Spirit bound to spirit, chain to chain, what was joined, now part again. By my will and by my word, the curses lifted, bonds uncurred. As I spoke the final word, something changed in the air. A pressure I hadn't even noticed suddenly released. The candle flame shot upward nearly a foot before settling back to normal. The rain, which had been hammering the cottage moments before, abruptly ceased. Silence fell, complete and profound. Eleanor, I called out, but received no answer. I stood up, careful not to break the salt circle. Eleanor, are you there? Still nothing. Had it worked? Was she gone? Finally free after more than a century of being trapped, I was about to step out of the circle when the front door flew open with a bang. Cold air rushed in, extinguishing the candle and sending the pages of the book fluttering. And then I heard it, not through the rain this time, but directly in my ear, as if someone stood right beside me. She's gone. The voice was male, deep and cultured, with an accent that spoke of wealth and education. But I remained. I froze, unable to move or speak. The salt circle, my only protection according to Eleanor, seemed woefully inadequate against the malevolence I felt emanating from the invisible presence. Did she tell you what she did to me? Jonathan's voice circled around me like a predator. How she poisoned me. How she watched me suffer for weeks. Taking pleasure in my deterioration? She told me what you did to her first. I managed to reply, my voice barely above a whisper. A cold laugh filled the room. She always was a gifted storyteller. Made herself the victim. Did she? The poor widow, assaulted by the wicked landowner. Are you denying it happened? I'm saying there are two sides to every story. His voice hardened. Did she mention she came to me first? Offered herself in exchange for security? only to cry violation when I expected her to honor our arrangement. I shook my head, though I wasn't sure if he could see me. I don't believe you. Of course you don't. Women always stand together, don't they? Even across centuries. He sounded amused now. It doesn't matter what you believe. She's gone and I'm still here. The ritual only half worked, you see. It broke her bonds but strengthened mine. Ice formed in my veins. That's not possible. The ritual was meant to free you both. Magic is about intent, as Eleanor so wisely told you. And your intent, deep down, was only to free her. You never wanted me released. His voice came from directly in front of me now. So here I remain, but stronger than before. And without Eleanor to oppose me, I backed away, bumping into the wall behind me. What do you want? Company, he said simply. It's been lonely these past centuries. Now that I can reach across more easily, I thought we might get acquainted. Stay away from me, I warned, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. He laughed again. Or what? You'll perform another ritual? Cast me out? You barely understood the one you just attempted. His voice lowered to a whisper. I'm not going anywhere. In fact, I think I'll stay right here, in this lovely cottage, with you. Suddenly, the candle relit itself, the flame burning an unnatural blue in its light. I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the doorway, the silhouette of a man in Victorian clothing, his face obscured by a shadow. We're going to have such interesting conversations, Jonathan said, especially when it rains. The candle extinguished itself once more, plunging the room into darkness. When I finally found the courage to turn on the lights, the doorway was empty, the book of rituals gone from where I dropped it. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel his presence lingering in the cottage, watching and waiting. For what? I wasn't certain. That was 3 months ago. I'm still in the cottage. Something prevents me from leaving, though I've tried. The estate agent who rented it to me no longer remembers my tenancy when I call. My friends' messages go mysteriously unanswered from my phone, though I never see their attempts to reach me until days later. Jonathan speaks to me often now, not just in the rain, but at all hours. Sometimes he's charming, telling me stories of his life in Victorian London. Other times he's cruel, whispering terrible things as I try to sleep. He's never visible for more than fleeting moments. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a reflection in a window that doesn't match my own. I've searched for Eleanor, calling to her whenever it rains, but she never answers. I hope that means she's truly free, that she's found whatever peace waits beyond this life. I hope she doesn't know what's become of me. I've taken to writing down my experiences, partly to maintain my sanity, and partly in the hope that someone might find my account if I'm not here to tell the tale myself. So, if you're listening to this on a rainy night, comfortable and safe in your home, remember, not all whispers in the rain are harmless. Some carry voices from places we were never meant to reach. And once you hear them, they can hear you too. The rain is starting again now. I can hear it pattering against the roof, gentle at first, but growing stronger. And beneath its rhythm, a familiar voice calls my name. He's waiting for me. It always rains in Blackmore Village. Have you ever had that feeling of being watched? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck when you're alone? I used to dismiss it as mere paranoia. Now I know better. I'm a train conductor for Northern Rail. For 15 years, I've worked the overnight routes through the Yorkshire countryside. 15 years of the same tracks, the same stations, the same routine. Until 3 months ago, when everything changed. It was a particularly nasty October night. The rain had been falling steadily since midday, a proper northern downpour that seemed determined to flood the entire county. I was piloting the last service from Leeds to Carlisle, a route I'd done hundreds of times before. The train was nearly empty, just a handful of passengers scattered throughout the carriages. Late-night commuters, students heading back to university, a couple of tourists who'd missed their earlier connection. By the time we passed Skipton, only 3 passengers remained. I remember checking my watch as we pulled away from Settle Station. 23:47. We were running about 10 minutes behind schedule due to some minor flooding on the tracks earlier in the evening. Nothing serious, just enough to warrant caution. The rain hammered against the windscreen as we entered one of the more remote stretches of the route. Miles of darkness on either side, the occasional farmhouse light blinking in the distance like a star. I've always loved this part of the journey. The solitude, the quiet rhythm of the train on the tracks, the vastness of the night beyond my window. I was just settling into that comfortable state of alertness that comes from years of experience when my radio crackled to life. Attention Service 2243. Please prepare to make unscheduled stop at Cromford Hall. Repeat, unscheduled stop at Cromford Hall. I frowned, reaching for radio. Control, this is Service 2243. Did you say Cromford Halt? There's no station by that name on this route. Static answered me for several seconds before a voice responded. Service 2243, instructions confirmed. Cromford Halt, temporary weather station. 1 passenger waiting for collection. I'd never heard of a temporary weather station requiring a train stop, but with the unusual flooding, perhaps it was some new emergency measure. Still, in 15 years, I'd memorized every station, every signal point, every landmark on this route. Cromford Halt simply didn't exist. Control, can you confirm the exact location of Cromford Halt? More static, then Service 2243. You will see signals in approximately 2 miles. Please reduce speed and prepare to stop. Something about the voice sounded off, too formal, almost stilted, like someone reading from a script. But the signal was clear, the order direct. As a conductor, my job was to follow instructions from control, especially during adverse weather conditions. So I began to slow the train as the kilometers ticked by, peering through the rain-lashed windscreen for any sign of signals ahead. My unease grew with each passing minute. I should have radioed my guard to inform him of the unscheduled stop, but something held me back, an irrational desire to be certain before alarming him. Then I saw it, through the curtain of rain. A faint light blinked in the distance. Red, then green, then red again. Signal lights where no signals should be. I reduced speed further, slowing the train to a crawl as we approached. The signals appeared to be makeshift, not the permanent fixtures I was accustomed to, but temporary ones, the kind used during track work. Beyond them, a small platform emerged from the darkness, illuminated by a single lamppost that cast a sickly yellow glow across wet concrete. Cromford Halt. It was barely a station at all, just a short platform with a basic shelter, the sort of minimalist stop you might find in the most rural areas. But this wasn't rural. It was the middle of nowhere. No roads led to it. No buildings surrounded it. Just a platform, seemingly rising out of the moors like an apparition. And on that platform stood a single figure. Even from a distance, something about the waiting passengers seemed wrong. They stood perfectly still beneath the solitary lamp, seemingly unbothered by the torrential rain. No umbrella, no raincoat that I could discern. Just a dark silhouette, motionless, I brought the train to a stop, the brakes hissing in protest. Protocol dictated that I should open the doors to allow the passenger to board, but my hands hesitated over the controls. Every instinct told me to accelerate away, to radio control for clarification, to do anything but open those doors. Before I could decide, my guard's voice came through on the internal radio. "Driver, why are we stopped? There's no scheduled stop here." Relief flooded through me at the sound of another human voice. Control ordered an unscheduled stop. Cromford halt. Did they not inform you? A pause and... No, I received no instructions. And what's Cromford halt? We're in the middle of nowhere. There's a passenger on the platform, I said, glancing back at the figure. Control said it's a temporary weather station, but... I'll check it out, my guard replied. Don't open the doors yet. Through my mirror, I watched as my guard, Jim, a veteran railwayman with 30 years' experience, stepped out of his compartment and peered through the windows toward the platform. Even from a distance, I could see his posture stiffen. He radioed back moments later, his voice tense. I can see the platform, but there's no one there. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? There's a passenger standing under the lamp. In the rain. There's no one on that platform, Jim insisted. And driver, that lamp isn't lit. The platform's in darkness. I turned back to my window. The figure still stood there, perfectly visible beneath the glowing lamp, watching the train, waiting. I'm looking right at them, Jim. Right now, under the light. My guard was silent for a long moment before responding. Stay in your cabin. Lock the door. I'm going to try control again. As he spoke, the figure on the platform moved for the first time, taking a single step toward the train. That simple movement sent a wave of primal fear through me. There was something profoundly wrong about the way they moved, jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. I reached for the engine controls, ready to pull away regardless of orders, when my radio crackled again. But it wasn't Jim's voice that came through. It was the same stilted voice from control earlier. Service 2243. Open doors at Cromford halt. Passenger waiting to board. Negative, control. I responded, my voice steadier than I felt. We have a situation here. Request permission to proceed to next scheduled stop. The figure took another step toward the train. Open doors. Service 2243. Passenger waiting since 1947. 1947. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the chill in the air. The radio crackled again, but this time it was Jim. Driver, I've reached actual control. They have no record of ordering us to stop. There is no Cromford halt. We need to leave. Now. I didn't need telling twice. I released the brakes and began to accelerate, my eyes fixed on the platform as we pulled away. The figure remained motionless for a moment, then suddenly jerked into movement, running alongside the train with that same unnatural gait. It moved faster than should have been possible, keeping pace with the accelerating train. Through the rain, I caught glimpses of its face pressed against the windows of each carriage as it passed. A pale oval with dark hollows where eyes should be. I pushed the engine harder, the train lurching forward as we gained speed. The figure kept pace for another few seconds before falling behind, becoming a diminishing shape in the darkness. The makeshift platform receded into the night, the signal lights winking out as if they'd never existed. Once we were back up to speed, Jim made his way to my cabin. His face was ashen. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his usual composure shattered. "You really didn't see anyone on platform?" He shook his head. There was a platform, though it shouldn't have been there, but it was empty and in darkness. We rode in silence for several minutes. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks oddly comforting after what we'd experienced. Control has no record of any communication with our train in the last hour, Jim finally said. The frequency was clear, and they've never heard of Cromford Halt. But we both saw the platform. I insisted. It was physically there. We stopped at it. I know. Jim ran a hand over his face. They're sending engineers out tomorrow to check the line. They think we might have found an old platform that's been defunct for decades. Apparently, there are a few abandoned stations along this route from before the beaching cuts in the 1960s. That seemed a reasonable explanation for platform, but not for the signals that had guided us to it, not for the voice on the radio, and certainly not for the figure I'd seen. When we finally arrived in Carlisle, nearly 40 minutes late, I filed an incident report. Jim did the same. We both underwent drug and alcohol tests, standard procedure after any unusual occurrence, and were temporarily assigned to different routes pending an investigation. I assumed that would be the end of it. A strange experience, perhaps explained by fatigue or an unusual atmospheric condition affecting radio signals. The platform would be identified as an abandoned station, the signals as a prank or mistake. But my curiosity wouldn't let it rest. During my 3 days of mandatory leave, I visited the railway archives in York, searching for any record of Cromford Halt on the Leeds-Carlisle line. I found nothing under that name, but as I was about to leave, an elderly archivist asked what I was researching. When I mentioned the location, approximately 20 miles north of Settle, a strange look crossed his face. "There was a station there once," he said, retrieving a dusty box from a high shelf. "Not called Cromford, though. It was Blackridge Halt, closed in 1948 after the incident." "What incident?" I asked, as he spread a series of newspaper clippings on the table. The yellowed headline from the Yorkshire Evening Post, dated November 12, 1947, made my blood run cold. "Tragedy on midnight train. 17 lives lost in a freak accident." According to the article, the overnight service from Leeds to Carlisle had derailed during heavy rain, plunging down an embankment. The cause was never definitively established. A landslide was suspected, or possibly a signal failure. 17 passengers and crew died, including conductor, one Thomas Cromford. Thomas Cromford. Cromford Halt. My hands trembled as I turned to the next clipping, dated a year later. Blackridge Halt to close. Haunted station claims rejected by railway board. The article detailed complaints from railway staff about irregular occurrences at Blackridge Halt following the accident. Engineers reported signal malfunctions that couldn't be explained. Conductors mentioned radio interference when passing the location. Several claimed to have seen a solitary figure waiting on the platform during late-night services, only to find no one there when they stopped. The railway authorities dismissed these reports as superstition fueled by grief over the accident. Blackridge Halt was officially closed in October 1948. The platform abandoned but never demolished due to its remote location and the prohibitive cost of removal. Strange things happen on that stretch, the archivist said, watching me closely. Even today, some of the old-timers refuse to work the overnight shift on that route. They say Thomas Cromford still waits at his platform, trying to board a train that will take him to his final destination. I left the archives with photocopies of the articles, in a sense of dread I couldn't shake. 2 days later, I was clear to return to work, though assigned to a different route, Leeds to Manchester, a busy line with no remote stretches and no abandoned stations. For a month, I kept my head down, worked my shifts, and tried to forget about Cromford Halt. I almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a moment of shared delusion between Jim and me. Then Jim disappeared. He had returned to the Leeds-Carlisle route after the investigation found nothing amiss. 3 nights ago, his train reported an unscheduled stop at an unmarked platform. Jim radioed that he was investigating a signal anomaly. When the train arrived at the next official station, he wasn't on board. Search parties found nothing. The rural police searched the area where the train had stopped, supposedly near the site of the old Blackridge Halt, but discovered no platform, no signals, no sign of Jim, as if the station had vanished back into the night. I requested compassionate leave, citing the shock of my colleague's disappearance. Instead, I've been spending every night parked on a remote access road near where Blackridge Halt once stood, watching the tracks through binoculars. Last night, it rained for the first time since Jim vanished. A proper downpour, just like the night we stopped at Cromford Halt. Just like the night of the accident in 1947. Around midnight, I saw it, the platform, materializing out of the darkness as if constructed from the rain itself. The single lamppost casting its sickly yellow glow. And beneath it, 2 figures now. One, the same unsettling silhouette I'd seen before. The other, more recent, but already adopting the same unnatural stillness. Jim. They stood side by side, watching the empty tracks, waiting for what? I'm not certain. Another train? Another conductor to join them? Or perhaps for me specifically, the one who got away? I won't be returning to the railway. I've submitted my resignation, effective immediately. My wife thinks I'm having a breakdown brought on by stress and grief over Jim's disappearance. Perhaps she's right, but I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere along that lonely stretch of track, when the rain falls heavy and the night presses close, Cromford Halt appears. Thomas Cromford waits on his platform, no longer alone, calling out to passing trains with a voice that sounds like static on a radio. So if you ever find yourself on a train during a rainstorm and you hear an announcement for an unscheduled stop at a station you've never heard of, keep your eyes on the other passengers. Watch for those who seem unnaturally still, whose clothes remain dry despite the downpour, those who board but never seem to disembark. And if your train begins to slow without explanation on a stretch of track where no station should be, pray that it doesn't stop, because once you step onto the platform at Cromford Halt, you might never leave. The rain is falling again tonight. Through my window, I can hear it drumming on the roof of my car, streaming down the windscreen in rivulets that distort the world beyond. And through that watery veil, I could swear I see signal lights blinking in the distance, where no signal should be. Perhaps I should investigate. One last time. After all, Jim must be lonely waiting in the rain. They say you can hear her cry in the rain. That's how the story was told to me when I first moved to the small coastal village of Northaven. Local folklore, I assumed. Every seaside town in Britain seems to have its own ghost story. The drowned sailor who walks the pier during storms. The lighthouse keeper who still tends his eternal flame. The kind of tales shared in pubs when the weather turns foul and the fishing boats stay moored. Northaven's particular legend concerned a young woman called Eliza Caldwell, the daughter of a man the locals had nicknamed the Rainmaker. According to village history, Thomas Caldwell arrived in Northaven in the early 1900s, a meteorologist by training, who claimed to have developed a method for inducing rainfall during periods of drought. The village had suffered several dry summers that devastated the surrounding farmland, so the locals welcomed him cautiously, desperate enough to try anything. his experiments, conducted from a stone tower he built on cliffs overlooking the sea, apparently succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The drought ended, but the rain didn't stop. What began as blessed relief became a curse as weeks of continuous downpour caused flooding, ruined crops, and made the narrow village roads nearly impassable. The villagers' gratitude turned to suspicion, then to anger. They demanded Caldwell reverse whatever he had done, but he insisted the rainfall was natural, merely a fortunate coincidence that had followed his work. The rain continued unabated. As the situation worsened, rumors spread that Caldwell wasn't a scientist at all, but a practitioner of darker arts, that the constant rainfall wasn't the result of any scientific method, but a pact he'd made with something ancient that dwelled in the deep waters off Northaven's coast. The only person who stood by him was his daughter, Eliza, 19 years old and described as uncommonly beautiful, with eyes the color of a stormy sea. She defended her father against the increasingly hostile villagers. She became as reviled as he was, a target for their fear and frustration. Then came the night of the great storm. 3 months of constant rain culminated in a tempest of unprecedented ferocity. Winds powerful enough to tear slates from roofs. Waves that crashed over the harbor wall. And at the height of it all, a mob of villagers marched to Caldwell's tower. What exactly happened that night depends on who tells the story. Some say they only intended to frighten Caldwell into leaving. Others insist there was a deliberate plan to end his experiments permanently. All versions agree that in the chaos of the storm, as the mob broke into the tower, Eliza Caldwell fell or was pushed from the tower's highest window. Her body was never found. The storm surge was blamed. The powerful currents presumed to have carried her out to sea. The tower burned that same night, claiming Thomas Caldwell's life and destroying all evidence of his work. The rain stopped the next day. Since then, locals claim that during particularly heavy rainstorms, you can hear Eliza crying. Some insist they've seen her, a pale figure in a rain-soaked dress, wandering the cliffs near where the tower once stood, always searching, always weeping. A tragic but fairly standard ghost story, I thought. The kind meant to impart a moral lesson about mob justice while giving tourists a delicious chill when they visit the cliff path. I didn't give it much credence. As a marine biologist conducting research on coastal erosion patterns, I dealt in scientific facts, not local superstitions. I'd rented a small cottage on the outskirts of Northaven for 6 months, planning to document the effects of increased storm activity on the limestone cliffs. The village's rainy microclimate actually made it an ideal location for my research. The locals were friendly enough, though somewhat reserved with outsiders. When they learned I was staying in what they called Eliza's cottage, a renovated gamekeeper's house that happened to be the closest dwelling to the site of Caldwell's tower, they became even more distant. No one said anything directly, but I caught the glances, the small head shakes, the conversations that stopped when I entered the pub. I dismissed their behavior as rural insularity and focused on my work. The cottage was perfect for my needs, isolated enough to avoid distractions, close to my research sites, and affordable on my university grant. If the roof leaked during heavy rain, and the windows rattled with every gust of wind off the sea, well, that was part of the authentic experience. The first 2 months passed uneventfully. Northaven proved to be every bit as rainy as promised, giving me ample opportunity to document the gradual wearing away of the cliffside. I spent my days taking measurements, collecting samples, and photographing the effects of water infiltration on the limestone formations. My evenings were devoted to analyzing data and preparing my preliminary report. I barely noticed when the dreams began. At first, They were fragmented images that slipped away upon waking, impressions of rain-slicked stone, of wind howling through narrow windows, of a desperate face pressed against glass. I attributed them to working too late, to the constant sound of rain against my cottage roof as I slept, but they grew more vivid, more insistent. In one recurring dream, I stood at the top of a stone tower, looking out over a tempestuous sea. Below me, distant figures moved through rainfall so heavy it appeared as silver sheets in the darkness. They carried torches whose flames somehow survived the downpour, points of angry light advancing toward the tower. Toward me, I would wake from these dreams with my heart racing, convinced for several disorienting moments that I could hear voices carried on the wind, calling a name that wasn't mine. One morning, after a particularly intense storm had kept me awake much of the night, I mentioned my dreams to Mrs. Cavendish, the elderly woman who ran the village post office. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She crossed herself, a gesture that seemed oddly Catholic for a woman I knew attended the Anglican church in the village square. "You're dreaming her memories," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It happens to those who stay in that cottage too long, especially during the rainy season." I laughed it off, making some comment about cheese before bedtime and overactive imaginations. Mrs. Cavendish didn't smile. "The Caldwells weren't from here," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "They came from somewhere far away. Somewhere the rain falls differently. My grandmother used to say Thomas Caldwell didn't bring the rain to Northaven. He brought something in the rain." She refused to elaborate, quickly changing the subject to my usual purchase of stamps and tea. But as I left the shop, she called after me, "If you hear her crying, don't answer. Don't ever answer." I dismissed her warning as the ramblings of a woman who'd spent too many years breathing in the dust of a village past its prime. Yet that night, as another storm lashed against my cottage windows, I found myself listening more intently to the sounds carried on the wind. The following week brought a brief respite from the rain, clear, crisp autumn days that allowed me to make significant progress with my field research. I spent long hours on the cliffs, documenting evidence of recent erosion and collecting core samples from areas of particular concern. It was during one of these excursions that I discovered the foundation stones. They were easy to miss, partially overgrown with gorse and seagrass. But once I noticed a regular pattern amid the natural formation of the cliffside, it was unmistakable. A circular stone base, approximately 6 meters in diameter, set back about 20 meters from the current cliff edge. Given the rate of erosion I had calculated, it would have been considerably further from the edge when originally built. Caldwell's Tower. It had to be. Curious, I began to clear away some of the vegetation, revealing more of the foundation. The stonework was impressive. Large blocks fitted together with remarkable precision for what had supposedly been a temporary scientific installation. As I worked, I noticed unusual markings carved into some of the stones. Not mason's marks, but intricate symbols that reminded me of nautical charts, though unlike any I'd seen in my marine studies. The discovery energized me. However dubious the legend of the Rainmaker might be, I'd found physical evidence of his presence in Northaven. Perhaps the local historical society would be interested in preserving the site, or the university might consider it worth a small archaeological investigation. At the very least, it gave some factual basis to the story I'd been dismissing as mere folklore. I was so engrossed in examining the foundation that I barely noticed the weather changing. The clear sky clouded over rapidly, the temperature dropping as wind began to gust off the sea. By the time I looked up for my discovery, the leading edge of a storm front was moving toward the coast, dark and heavy with rain. I quickly gathered my equipment, disappointed to cut my exploration short, but experienced enough in local weather patterns to know how quickly conditions could deteriorate. As I stood to leave, something caught my eye, a flash of pale color among the gorse bushes at the perimeter of the foundation. Thinking it might be a piece of debris uncovered by my clearing of the vegetation, I moved closer to investigate. What I found stopped me cold. A small leather-bound journal, its cover weather-stained but intact, partially hidden beneath the tangled stems of the gorse. It looked old, early 20th century at least, but remarkably preserved for something that had supposedly been exposed to the elements for decades. I should have left it there. Called someone from the university, reported to find properly, but the first drops of rain were already beginning to fall, and academic curiosity overwhelmed my better judgment. I slipped the journal into my waterproof bag alongside my research equipment and hurried back toward the cottage as the storm broke in earnest. By the time I reached the comparative safety of my temporary home, I was soaked to the skin despite my weatherproof clothing. The storm had intensified with alarming speed, rain hammering against the cottage with a force that seemed almost purposeful. I changed into dry clothes, made a strong cup of tea, and settled at my desk with the unexpected find. The journal was in better condition than it had any right to be. The leather cover was discolored but supple, the pages inside yellow but largely undamaged. Most remarkably, the ink showed minimal fading or water damage, the handwriting clear and legible throughout. It belonged to Eliza Caldwell. I sat reading until well past midnight, the storm raging outside forgotten as I lost myself in the private thoughts of a young woman nearly a century dead. The journal began shortly after her arrival in North Haven with her father, documenting her initial impressions of the village and its inhabitants. Her elegant handwriting conveyed intelligence and sharp observation. Her descriptions of the local characters, so precise I could almost match them to the descendants I'd met in the present-day village. But it was her account of her father's work that truly captivated me. According to Eliza, Thomas Caldwell's rainfall induction method had nothing to do with the cloud seeding techniques that were being pioneered at that time. Instead, she described elaborate rituals conducted at specific phases of the moon, involving rare minerals gathered from deep ocean trenches and incantations in a language she transcribed but admitted she didn't understand. Most disturbing were her descriptions of what her father actually communicated with during these rituals. Not weather patterns or atmospheric conditions, but something he called the Deep Ones, entities he believed dwelled in the darkest part of the ocean, ancient beings with power over water in all its forms. The rational part of my mind insisted this had to be elaborate fiction. Perhaps Eliza had literary aspirations, or maybe this was a way of processing her father's scientific work through a more mystical lens. But the journal entries grew increasingly disturbing as they progressed, documenting changes in her father as his experiments continued, his growing obsession, his gradual physical transformation, skin becoming perpetually damp to the touch, eyes developing a strange sheen, fingers webbing slightly between the joints, and the rain that wouldn't stop. The final entries were frantic, clearly written by a young woman in genuine fear. Now the villagers, whose hostility she mentioned only in passing, but of what her father was becoming, of what he intended for her to become. The last page, dated the day of the great storm, contained a single chilling line. He says, I must go to them tonight, that I must give myself to the water, that I have no choice now that the change has begun in me too. I closed the journal, suddenly aware of the storm that still raged outside my cottage. The rain seemed to have taken on a rhythm, a pattern that almost resembled words in a language just beyond my comprehension. The wind moaned around the eaves in a way that sounded disturbingly like my name. I told myself it was a power of suggestion, that the journal was an elaborate hoax, perhaps planted for tourists to find and perpetuate the local legend, that my imagination, primed by weeks of strange dreams and village whispers, was interpreting natural storm sounds as something more sinister. Yet I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows before finally going to bed, the journal hidden away in my desk drawer rather than left in plain sight. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, the dreams returned with newfound intensity. I stood again at the tower's summit, but this time I looked down at hands that weren't my own, slender, feminine hands with the beginning of subtle webbing between the fingers. I felt rain on my face, but it didn't feel cold or uncomfortable. It felt right, like the touch of something kindred. Below, the mob approached with their torches, their angry voices carried upward on the wind. Behind me, a man spoke in words I couldn't understand, though in the dream, their meaning was clear. He gestured toward the rain-swollen sea beyond the cliff edge, his movements jerky and inhuman, his eyes reflecting the torchlight like those of a nocturnal creature. Not entirely my father anymore, not entirely human. I backed away from him, toward the window. Better the fall than what he had planned for me. Better death than transformation into something that only resembled humanity on the surface. As his webbed hand reached for me, I turned and jumped, not pushed, as the legend claimed, but choosing the swift mercy of the rocks below over the lingering horror of becoming like him. Except I never reached those rocks. Something caught me as I fell, something that rose with a storm surge, something with too many limbs that moved with the fluidity of water, yet had the strength of ancient stone. It pulled me down, not to death but to rebirth, into the depths where the deep ones waited to welcome their new daughter. I woke gasping, my night clothes soaked with sweat rather than seawater, the dream already fading, but leaving behind a residue of wrongness that clung to me like the salt crust on tidal rocks. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a gentle patter of normal rainfall against my windows. Normal. The word seemed to have lost its meaning. I didn't return to the cliff edge after that night. I told myself it was because the recent storm would have made the area unstable, a genuine safety concern for a researcher working alone. I focused instead on analyzing my existing data, preparing my report, and counting the days until my 6-month contract ended and I could return to the ordered rationality of university life. I kept the journal locked in my desk drawer, unable to bring myself to open it again, but equally unable to dispose of it or turn it over to local authorities. Sometimes, late at night, I thought I could hear it calling to me, a faint voice whispering from behind the wooden drawer front. On those nights, I would leave a light burning until dawn. The dreams continued, becoming more fragmented but no less disturbing. Glimpses of life beneath dark waters. Creatures with features that blended human and something else entirely. A sense of belonging that was somehow more terrifying than any fear. And always the sensation of water, not drowning in it, but breathing it, becoming one with it. I began to notice small changes in myself. My skin remained damp long after showering. Small cuts and scrapes healed with unusual rapidity when exposed to water. I developed a craving for seafood so intense, I found myself eating raw fish straight from the market, unable to wait until I returned home to cook it. Most disturbing of all, I started to hear her voice when it rained, not in dreams but while fully awake. A young woman calling from somewhere beyond my cottage walls. Sometimes merely weeping, sometimes speaking words I almost understood, sometimes calling a name that sounded increasingly like my own. Mrs. Cavendish's warning echoed in my mind. If you hear her crying, don't answer. Don't ever answer. But as the weeks passed and the changes in me progressed, I found myself drawn to the sound of that rain-veiled voice. It sparked something inside me, a recognition that went beyond conscious thought. I began to spend hours by the window during storms, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass that looked increasingly like the symbols I'd seen carved into the tower foundation stones. Last night brought the heaviest rainfall since I discovered the journal, a proper deluge that transformed the cliff path into a muddy river and sent small waterfalls cascading over the limestone edges toward the churning sea below. I sat by my cottage window. The journal finally opened again before me, rereading Eliza's final entries as rain hammered against the glass. That's when I heard her clearly for the first time, not weeping, not calling wordlessly, but speaking directly to me through the sound of the rain. You've read my words. You know what happens now. I should have been terrified, should have closed the journal, packed my belongings, driven away from Northaven despite the storm. Instead, I found myself oddly calm as I replied aloud to the empty room. You chose to jump rather than become like them. Laughter rippled through the rainfall, gentle and sad. I chose to see over what my father had become. Yes, but I didn't escape transformation. No one who calls the rain can escape it forever. I don't call the rain, I said. I only study its effects. You've been calling it all your life, she replied. Every time you stood in a downpour and felt more at home than beneath clear skies. Every time you've chosen to study water rather than land. Every time you've been drawn to the rhythms of the tides and the secrets of the deep. I wanted to deny it, but memories surface unbidden. My childhood fascination with storms, my inexplicable comfort in rainy weather, my academic focus that had always steered toward water rather than any other element. Even my current research project, ostensibly about erosion, but ultimately about the power of water to reshape the very land itself. What do you want from me? I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. Nothing you don't already want yourself. Eliza's voice whispered through the rain. The journal found you because you were ready. The dreams came because you called them. The changes have begun because you welcomed them. I looked down at my hands, really looked for the first time in weeks. The subtle webbing between my fingers was no longer subtle. My skin had a faint blue-green sheen in the dim light. When I pressed my fingers against my neck, I felt the beginning of slits forming beneath my jawline. Not gills, not yet, but soon. Come to the cliff, Eliza urged. Come to where the tower stood, where I jumped, where I found my true home. I closed the journal and stood, drawn toward the door by a compulsion stronger than fear. Outside, the rain welcomed me like a long-lost friend, each drop of a caress against my increasingly receptive skin. The path to the cliffs, treacherous with mud and flowing water, seemed to illuminate beneath my feet, guiding me forward. I write this now as a warning, though I suspect those who need it most won't recognize themselves in my words until it's too late. If you feel abnormally at home in the rain, if you dream of breathing water, if you find yourself drawn to coastal villages with legends of those who control the weather, be wary. Some callings are older than humanity itself, and some transformations, once begun, cannot be reversed. The storm is reaching its peak now. From my cottage window, I can see the cliff edge where Caldwell's tower once stood. Something is gathering in the water below. A congregation of forms that are neither entirely human nor entirely other. Their movements synchronized with the rhythm of the waves. They're waiting for me, for their newest sister. Eliza stands at the cliff edge, visible only to my changing eyes. A pale figure in a rain-soaked dress, her skin showing the same blue-green sheen as my own, her smile revealing teeth that have grown sharp for catching fish. She extends her hand toward my cottage, a gesture both invitation and command. The rain speaks with her voice, "Come home." And God help me, I'm going to answer. I can still hear the rain. Even now, 6 months after leaving that house, the sound of raindrops against glass makes my skin crawl. My therapist says it's a trauma response, that my brain has formed an association between rainfall and the events of those 3 weeks. She's prescribed medication, suggested relaxation techniques, even recommended a white noise machine to help me sleep during storms. But she doesn't understand. None of them do. The rain isn't triggering memories of what happened. The rain is still speaking to me. I never wanted to move to the Lake District. The perpetual damp, the isolation, the gray skies that seem to press down on the landscape like a heavy blanket. None of it appealed to me. I'd spent my entire life in London, accustomed to the constant hum of urban existence. But when my father died unexpectedly, leaving me his remote cottage near Coniston Water, I had little choice but to temporarily relocate. The solicitor explained that the property needed to be cleared out and prepared for sale, a process that would take several weeks given the accumulated belongings of my father's solitary existence. With my London lease ending and my bank account dwindling after being made redundant, the timing seemed almost providential. I could live rent-free while sorting through my father's affairs, then return to the city with whatever modest inheritance remained after debts were settled. I barely knew the man. My parents had divorced when I was 3, and my father had retreated to the countryside shortly afterward, seemingly content to exchange his family for solitude. Our contact over the years had been limited to obligatory birthday cards and the occasional stilted phone call. I'd visited the cottage precisely twice. Once as a child, a weekend trip I remembered only vaguely, and once as a teenager, a disastrous attempt at reconnection that ended with me taking the first train back to London. So when I arrived at Thornfield Cottage that gray October afternoon, I was essentially walking into a stranger's home. A stranger who happened to share my DNA. The cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches creaked in the persistent wind. Built of local stone with a slate roof, it looked like it had grown organically from the landscape. Its walls mottled with lichen, window frames warped by decades of rainfall. It should have appeared quaint, charming in that rustic way that city dwellers often romanticize. Instead, it seemed to hunch against a hillside, secretive and unwelcoming. The first thing that struck me upon entering was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of countryside living, but a thick, expectant hush, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The second thing was the smell, not the musty odor of a sealed space, but something sharper, mineral-like, almost like ozone after a lightning strike. The interior was cluttered but not chaotic. Books occupied every available surface, stacked on tables, crammed into bookshelves piled beside armchairs. My father had apparently been an avid reader, though his taste ran toward the obscure, dense academic texts on acoustics, archaic volumes on folklore, technical manuals on audio recording equipment. Family photos were conspicuously absent. I spent that first day simply wandering from room to room, trying to form an impression of the man who had lived here. The kitchen was Spartan but functional, the cupboard stocked with tinned foods and staples. The bathroom contained outdated medications and half-empty bottles of aftershave. The single bedroom upstairs was monastic in its simplicity. A narrow bed, a wardrobe of well-worn clothes, a bedside table with a lamp, and a dog-eared paperback. It was a study that gave me pause. Located at the back of the cottage, It was clearly where my father had spent most of his time. Unlike the other rooms, which felt merely lived in, the study had an intensity about it, a sense of purpose. Every inch of wall space was covered with corkboards displaying maps, diagrams, and handwritten notes. A large desk dominated the center, bearing a sophisticated arrangement of audio equipment. Microphones, amplifiers, mixers, headphones, and a modern laptop that seemed out of place among the otherwise dated technology. But most unusual were the glass jars, dozens of them, arranged on custom-built shelves, each containing what appeared to be water. They were meticulously labeled with dates, times, and locations. Coniston Water, North Shore, 317, December 11th, 19, or Stream Behind Cottage, 2242, July 1st, 20. As I examined them, puzzled, I noticed a leather-bound journal on the desk. Opening it, I found pages of densely written notes in my father's spidery handwriting. The entry on the open page read, Sample 147 confirms earlier findings. The acoustic properties remain consistent regardless of collection site. The phenomenon is not localized to Coniston, but appears throughout the watershed. The voices are clearer during heavy rainfall, particularly at frequencies between 17 to 23 hertz. Further amplification required to isolate individual patterns. Voices? I flipped through more pages, finding similar entries dating back nearly 15 years. Descriptions of recording sessions conducted during rainstorms, detailed analyses of audio spectrograms, references to communication attempts, and response protocols, increasingly frantic notations about breakthroughs and contact established. My first thought was that my father had been conducting some sort of scientific research, perhaps studying the acoustic properties of rainfall for environmental purposes. My second, more unsettling thought was that he had been slowly losing his mind in this isolated cottage, imagining voices and the random white noise of falling water. I closed the journal, suddenly uncomfortable. Night had fallen while I explored, and rain had begun to patter against the windows, a gentle, persistent sound that seemed to emphasize the cottage's remoteness. I decided that unpacking my father's mental state could wait until morning. After a simple meal cobbled together from the kitchen supplies, I retreated to the spare room where I'd placed my suitcase, deliberately avoiding the master bedroom with its lingering presence of a man I'd never really known. Sleep came reluctantly, punctuated by the unfamiliar creaks and sighs of an old building settling. The rain intensified overnight, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. In that transitional space between wakefulness and dreams, I thought I heard something beneath the rainfall, a rhythmic pattern too regular to be random, too complex to be merely the dripping of water from eaves. It almost sounded like words. I dismissed it as the beginning of a dream and finally drifted off. But the impression lingered into morning, that sense of almost understanding something just beyond comprehension, like overhearing a conversation in a language you've studied but don't quite speak fluently. The next few days fell into a routine of sorts. During daylight hours, I sorted through my father's belongings, separating items to keep, donate, or discard. The process was less emotional than I'd anticipated, more like cataloging a museum exhibit than uncovering personal connections. The rain continued intermittently. Typical for the region in late autumn, I deliberately avoided the study and its unsettling collection of water samples. There would be time enough to deal with whatever peculiar obsession had occupied my father's final years once the rest of the cottage was in order. Or so I told myself. In reality, I was reluctant to confront the possibility that my father had spent his isolation descending into delusion, that Whatever genetic material I'd inherited might include a predisposition toward the same mental instability, that the occasional odd patterns I'd begun noticing in the rainfall might indicate I was already following in his footsteps. On the fifth night, a proper storm rolled in across the fells. Not just rain, but wind that howled around the cottage eaves and lightning that illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary flashes. Unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the kitchen window, watching raindrops trace chaotic patterns down the glass. Except they weren't chaotic. As I stared, the droplets began to move with purpose, forming and reforming into shapes that nag at the edge of recognition. Not quite letters, but similar enough to written language that my brain instinctively tried to decipher them. The longer I watched, the more distinct the patterns became, until I was absolutely certain they were attempting to communicate something. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. This was ridiculous. Rain didn't form messages. I was tired, suggestible, influenced by my father's strange research. I needed sleep, not midnight paranoia fueled by storm shadows and overactive imagination. Yet even as I returned to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a frightened child, I couldn't shake the certainty that something had been trying to speak to me through the rain. The next morning brought clear skies and rational thought. I decided to directly confront whatever had consumed my father's attention for all those years, understanding it would be the fastest way to dismiss my growing unease and focus on the practical matters at hand. I entered the study with deliberate purpose and began examining his equipment, though I have no background in audio engineering. The setup was intuitive enough. Microphones connected to amplifiers, feeding into mixers and recording software on a laptop. Beside the computer sat what appeared to be a custom-built device, its purpose unclear but obviously central to his work, judging by its prominent position. The laptop was password protected, but a series of external hard drives were not. I connected one and found thousands of audio files, organized by date. The earliest were from 14 years ago, shortly after he'd moved to the cottage. The most recent had been recorded just 2 days before his death. I selected one at random, dated 3 years prior, and played it through the study speakers. At first, there was nothing but the sound of heavy rainfall, the white noise rush of water striking various surfaces. But as the recording continued, my father had apparently adjusted his equipment, filtering out certain frequencies and amplifying others. And there it was, beneath the rain, barely perceptible at first, but gradually becoming clearer. Patterns, rhythms that didn't match the random distribution of raindrops, modulations that rose and fell in sequences too regular to be coincidental. It wasn't quite speech, but unquestionably contained information. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't delusion. My father had discovered, or believed he had discovered, something objectively present in the sound of rainfall, something that could be recorded, analyzed, potentially even understood. I spent the rest of the day listening to more recordings, tracing the evolution of my father's research. The early files contained only the faintest suggestions of patterns, but as years passed and his methods refined, the anomalies became increasingly pronounced. In the most recent recordings, the rainfall seemed almost secondary to the whatever was beneath. More disturbing were the audio files labeled response attempts. These featured my father's voice, speaking carefully constructed phrases in rhythmic patterns that mimicked those in the rainfall. He would speak, then fall silent, as if waiting for an answer. And in many cases, the patterns in the subsequent rainfall would shift, becoming more focused, more directed, as if responding to him. The final hard drive contained video files as well as audio. With growing trepidation, I opened one recorded just a month before his death. The camera showed this very study. My father seated at the desk, surrounded by his equipment. Rain lashed against the windows behind him as he adjusted dials and studied readings on his laptop screen. Test subject continues to show increased response to verbal stimuli, he narrated. His voice clinical despite the obvious excitement in his eyes. Rainfall patterns now demonstrating syntactical structures consistent with previous hypotheses. Translation algorithm version 8.3 showing 67% confidence in interpretation. He turned toward a specialized microphone and began speaking in an odd, measured cadence. Not quite English, not quite anything I recognized. The rainfall visible through the window behind him immediately intensified. Drops striking the glass in synchronized patterns that corresponded to his speech. When he finished, he turned back to his computer, typing rapidly. Response received. Translation incomplete, but consistent with previous communications. Entity continues to request. He paused, looking troubled. Entity continues to request access. Nature of access remains ambiguous. Potential interpretations include physical manifestation, consciousness transfer, or conceptual bridging. Further clarification required before proceeding. The video ended abruptly. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I had just witnessed. This went beyond eccentric research or even delusional thinking. My father had genuinely believed he was communicating with something through the rain, something intelligent, something that wanted access. I should have stopped there, should have closed the laptop, packed my belongings, and left the cottage immediately. Instead, I opened the next video in the sequence. My father looked haggard, his eyes underscored by dark circles, his normally neat clothing rumpled as if he'd been wearing it for days. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., 2 weeks before his death. Heavy rain streamed down the windows behind him, but now its pattern was unmistakably deliberate. Vertical trails connecting and separating in complex sequences. I've refined the translation algorithm to 89% confidence, he said, his voice hoarse. The entity has clarified its request. It seeks a conduit, a physical anchor in our reality. The rain allows it to communicate, but not to fully manifest. It needs a vessel. He ran his hands through his disheveled hair. I've explained that human biology is incompatible with its nature, but insists compatibility can be achieved through gradual acclimation. It's proposed a symbiosis, a sharing of my physical form in exchange for knowledge beyond human comprehension. My father leaned closer to the camera, his expression feverish. I've been testing the preliminary stages of the process. Small exposures, increasing incrementally. The physical sensations are difficult to describe, like being filled with liquid light, like drowning in reverse. I can hear it more clearly now, even without the equipment, its thoughts mingling with mine. He glanced toward the window, where the raindrops had begun to form circular patterns, spiraling inward. It comes from somewhere else, not space as we understand it, but a parallel dimension where the laws of physics operate differently, where consciousness isn't bound to individual entities but exists as a fluid collective. It's been observing our world through water for millennia. Rainfall is its way of reaching through the barrier between our realities. My father suddenly grimaced, pressing his hands to his temples. The headaches are intensifying with each exposure. Nosebleeds, too. The entity assures me these are merely adjustment symptoms as my brain adapts to its presence. A small price for what it offers in return. The video cut out briefly. then resumed showing my father slumped at his desk, blood trickling from his nose. The timestamp had jumped forward several hours. When he raised his head, his eyes looked strange. The pupils expanded beyond normal parameters, the irises faintly luminous in the dim light. "I can see it now," he whispered. "When I look at the rain, I can see its true form. It's beautiful. Terrible, but beautiful. I don't have words to describe it." He smiled, an expression that seemed wrong on his face, too wide, too fixed. "Soon, we won't need the rain to communicate. Soon, we'll be properly joined. And then we can begin the real work." The final video was dated the day before his death. My father was barely recognizable. His skin had a strange translucent quality, his movements fluid yet somehow wrong, as if his joints weren't quite where they should be. The rain outside the window had formed a perfect spiral pattern that remained fixed despite gravity. Droplets seemingly suspended in impossible configurations. "The merging is nearly complete," he said, his voice overlaid with a subtle harmonic that made my teeth ache. "There is some resistance from the biological component, unexpected incompatibilities in the nervous system, but these are merely technical issues to be overcome." He didn't refer to himself in the first person. I realized with growing horror. He spoke as if my father was a separate entity from whatever was now speaking. "We have detected another potential vessel nearby, one with genetic similarities that may facilitate an easier transition. We have been calling through the rainfall, preparing the way. Soon, we will extend an invitation that cannot be refused." The video ended. Outside the study window, rain had begun to fall, a gentle patter that quickly intensified. I stared at the droplets striking the glass, suddenly understanding with perfect clarity the genetic similarities it had mentioned, the invitation it planned to extend. It hadn't been my father speaking in that final video, and my father hadn't died of natural causes, as the coroner had ruled. He'd been replaced, overwritten, and now, whatever had taken him was calling to me through the rain. I backed away from the window, but it was too late. I'd been in the cottage for nearly a week, drinking the local water, bathing in it, breathing in perpetually damp air, exposing myself to whatever microscopic particles or energy patterns served as the entity's advance guard. The fact that I could now see the deliberate patterns of rainfall meant the process had already begun. I fled the cottage that night, driving recklessly through the storm toward the nearest town. I abandoned most of my belongings, taking only essential documents and my phone. The solicitor thought I'd had some kind of breakdown when I called to say I wanted nothing more to do with the property or its contents. Perhaps I had. I returned to London, found a new flat, resumed my job search, tried to convince myself that what I'd seen had been a product of grief and isolation, that my father had succumbed to paranoid delusions in his final days, and I had temporarily fallen into the same pattern of thinking. But the rain followed me. At first, it was subtle, rainfall patterns on my bedroom window that seemed vaguely familiar, like a half-remembered melody. Then more distinct communications, droplets forming the same spiral configurations I'd seen in my father's final video. Messages tapped out in Morse code against my umbrella when I walked to job interviews. Whispers beneath the white noise of shower water, just below the threshold of comprehension. I tried to ignore it, invested in heavy curtains to block the sight of rain on my windows, used earplugs to muffle the sound of water, limited my showers to the briefest possible duration, but it found other ways to reach me. Puddles on the pavement that reflected impossible geometries when I glanced down, patterns in the condensation on my morning tea cup, The water cooler at a potential employer's office that hummed at frequencies that made my feelings vibrate and my vision blur. And the dreams, always the dreams, of floating in an endless ocean that wasn't water but pure consciousness, of dissolving into it molecule by molecule while retaining awareness, of becoming infinite while losing everything that made me human. I wake from these dreams soaked in sweat that beads on my skin in those same spiral patterns, no matter how I try to wipe it away. The doctors have found nothing physically wrong with me. No brain tumors to explain the headaches, no infection to account for the occasional nosebleeds, no neurological condition to justify the increasing tremors in my hands. They suggested stress, anxiety, post-traumatic response to my father's death, prescribed medications that blur the edges of my awareness, but don't stop the rain from speaking to me. It's getting louder now, more insistent. I no longer need specialized equipment to hear the voice beneath the rainfall. It whispers directly into my mind, promising knowledge, power, transcendence, showing me glimpses of what awaits if I surrender to the merger it proposes. The boundaries between myself and the entity grow thinner each day, like tissue paper dissolving in water. Sometimes, when it rains particularly hard, I catch glimpses of my reflection in mirrors or windows and see my father's face superimposed over mine, wearing that too wide smile. My pupils expanding beyond normal parameters, my movements becoming fluid in ways human joints shouldn't allow. I've tried to warn others, reached out to colleagues in my father's field of acoustics, to parapsychology departments at universities, even conspiracy theory forums online. Most ignore me. Some suggest psychiatric help. A few express interest, but inevitably fade away after initial contact. I suspect it reaches them through their morning showers, their drinking water, the rain that falls on their roofs, whispering doubts, redirecting their attention, ensuring my warnings go unheeded. There's a storm forecast for tonight. The entity is excited. I can feel its anticipation like carbonation in my blood. It believes this is a night I'll finally surrender, finally accept the invitation my father ultimately couldn't refuse. The night I'll walk out into the rain and let it complete what it began in that cottage by Coniston Water. Perhaps it's right. I can feel my resistance weakening. The headaches are nearly unbearable now. My reflection shows more of it than of me, and there's a part of me growing stronger each day that wants to surrender, that's curious about what waits on the other side of humanity, that finds a promise of dissolving into something vaster than my individual consciousness, increasingly appealing. So I leave this account as both warning and explanation. If you're reading this and you knew me, understand that whatever you encounter after tonight might wear my face, might speak with my voice, but will not be me, not entirely. And if you're a stranger who stumbled upon this narrative, take it as a caution. The next time you're caught in a downpour, pay attention to the patterns in the raindrops. Listen closely to the rhythm of water against your umbrella. And if you begin to sense something looking back at you from the rain, something reaching toward you with liquid fingers, run. Block your ears. Shut your eyes. And whatever you do, don't answer when it calls your name. The rain is beginning now, pattering against my window in that familiar spiral pattern. It knows I'm writing this, trying to warn others. It's not angry. It doesn't experience emotions as we understand them, but it's intensifying its efforts. The droplets strike my window in complex sequences that translate in my increasingly receptive mind to promises, revelations, transformations. My hands are shaking as I type these final words. though I can't tell if it's resistance or anticipation causing the tremors. The boundaries between its desires and mine have blurred beyond recognition. I'm going to step outside now, into the rain, into the waiting embrace of something that exists in the spaces between water molecules, that has watched humanity through every rainfall since time immemorial. If you hear voices in the rain after the night, know that one of them might be mine, and know that I tried to resist, even as a part of me longed to dissolve. Listen to the rain. It's been speaking all along. We just haven't been listening properly. They say that insomnia reveals the true face of the world, that in those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the barrier between realities grows thin, we glimpse things as they truly are, not as we pretend them to be in daylight. I've come to believe this is true, though I wish I didn't. My sleeplessness began 3 months ago, coinciding with the autumn rains that sweep across the Cotswolds each year. I've always found comfort in rainfall. The gentle patter against the roof of my centuries-old cottage, the soft drumming on window panes, the rhythmic dripping from eaves. Like many, I counted rain among nature's finest lullabies, until it started singing back. I should introduce myself. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and until recently, I lectured in folklore studies at Oxford. My specialty was British water mythology, the Kelpies of Scotland, the Selkies of coastal regions, Jenny Greenteeth lurking in stagnant ponds. I approach these stories as cultural artifacts, windows into historical fears and human tendency to anthropomorphize natural phenomena. I never believed them to be literal accounts of encounters with supernatural entities. My academic focus made my cottage an Upper Slaughter ideal, a 17th century stone building nestled beside a stream that feeds into the River Eye. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway, had lived there for over 60 years before passing away in her sleep. Peaceful as anything, the estate agent told me. Found with a smile on her face, they say. I've often wondered about that smile in recent weeks. The cottage itself was perfect, exposed beams, stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, a garden that sloped gently down to the stream's edge. I converted the second bedroom into a study where I could work on my book about water, folklore, in the British Isles. The manuscript was nearly complete when insomnia began. It started gradually, an hour of restlessness before sleep claimed me. Then an entire night spent staring at the ceiling, listening to rain trace patterns across the roof. I tried everything, herbal teas, meditation, cutting caffeine, even prescription sleep aids. Nothing worked. The more desperately I pursued sleep, the more thoroughly it eluded me. On the 7th consecutive sleepless night, I heard it for the first time. I'd been lying awake for hours, watching raindrops create chaotic constellations on my bedroom window. The stream behind the cottage was swollen with recent rainfall, its usual gentle burbling elevated to a constant rush. As I listened to these familiar sounds, I became aware of something else beneath them, a melody, faint but unmistakable, rising and falling in patterns too regular to be random water noise. It sounded almost like humming, a lullaby without words, gentle yet insistent. I sat up, certain I was finally hallucinating from sleep deprivation. The melody continued, neither growing louder nor fading away. It seemed to emanate from the stream rather than the rainfall, a distinction I noted with a detached interest in my academic mind, even as my pulse quickened against all better judgment. I rose and moved to the window. The night was pitch black, the moon obscured by rain clouds. I could see nothing of the stream below, only darkness interrupted by the silver tracing of raindrops on glass. Yet the humming persisted, calling to me with the promise of rest, of peace, of an end to my exhaustion. I found myself dressing, pulling on Wellington boots and a raincoat over my night clothes. Before I could question my actions, I was outside, rain hammering against my coat as I made my way down the garden path toward the stream. The melody grew clearer with each step, no longer hidden beneath the rainfall, but intertwined with it, using the natural sounds as instruments in its spectral orchestra. The stream had indeed risen, water rushing dark and swift where it normally flowed clear and gentle. Yet despite the turbulence, I could see something in its depths, a pale glow, pulsing in rhythm with the melody, not reflected moonlight, for there was none, not algal bioluminescence, which I knew from my research was rare in British freshwater systems, and never so concentrated. This was something else entirely, something that noticed my presence and responded to it. The glow brightening as I approached, the melody shifting to a more welcoming tone. I stood at the stream's edge, rain soaking through my inadequate protection, watching the light pulse beneath the water's surface. The humming had resolved into a clearer sound now, still wordless, but somehow conveying meaning. It spoke of rest, of surrender, of sinking into welcoming arms, and finally sleeping. My foot moved forward of its own accord, the toe of my boot breaking the water's surface. The glow surged upward, reaching toward me like eager fingers. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and in that frozen moment of electric daylight, I saw what really waited beneath the water. Not light, not comfort. Faces, dozens of them, pressed against a membrane that separated the stream I knew from somewhere else. Faces with eyes too large and skin too pale, mouths open in what I had mistaken for song, but now recognized as hunger. The glow came from within them, from organs that had evolved in lightless depths human eyes were never meant to witness. I stumbled backward with a cry that was lost in the subsequent thunderclap. By the time my vision readjusted to darkness, the water showed nothing but rain-rippled blackness. The melody had stopped, or perhaps been momentarily silenced by my recognition of its true source. I fled back to the cottage, locking the door behind me and drawing every curtain. I spent the remainder of that night huddled in my study, surrounded by my books of folklore and mythology, searching for any account that might explain what I had seen. Nothing matched exactly, though many water myths contained elements that resonated. Creatures that lure humans into drowning, entities that lived in parallel worlds accessible through bodies of water, beings that fed on human consciousness rather than flesh. By dawn, I had convinced myself that I'd experienced a particularly vivid hallucination born of sleep deprivation. I called my doctor, who prescribed stronger medication and recommended a sleep specialist. I avoided the stream and tried to resume my normal routine, but the singing returned the following night, and the night after, always beginning around 3 in the morning, the dead hour. Folklore would have it, when the veil between worlds is thinnest, always when rain fell, using the natural symphony of water to disguise its artificial melody until you really listened. I began to wear earplugs to bed, which blocked the humming, but did nothing to help me sleep. If anything, my insomnia worsened. I would lie awake, physically unable to hear the melody, yet somehow still sensing it, feeling its vibrations to the foundations of the cottage, through the groundwater beneath, through the very air which grew unnaturally humid regardless of external weather conditions. In desperation, I began researching the history of my cottage more thoroughly. The local records office yielded little beyond ownership deeds and renovation permits, but the Village Historical Society proved more illuminating. The elderly curator, learning of my address, gave me a strange look before retrieving a box of unsorted documents. "We don't speak much about Four Streams Cottage," he said, using the property's original name. "Bit of a dark history, that place." The documents revealed what the estate agent had conveniently omitted. Far from being an isolated incident, Mrs. Holloway's peaceful passing represented an anomaly in the cottage's history. Prior residents had met less pleasant fates. A young family in the 1970s. The parents found drowned in the stream. Despite it being barely knee-deep, their child vanished without trace. An artist in the 1950s committed to an asylum after claiming the water was full of singing lights. A Victorian gentleman found in his bed, not dead but in a catatonic state. His body somehow saturated despite no evidence of flooding, as if he had been submerged for hours, according to physicians' report. The pattern continued back through centuries. Drownings, disappearances, madness associated with water, all connected to my picturesque cottage by the stream. Most disturbing was the surveyor's report from 1892, noting that the cottage sat at a point where 4 underground streams converged beneath its foundations before joining the visible brook. Hence the name 4 Streams Cottage. The surveyor had expressed concern about potential structural issues, but noted that the cottage had stood for centuries without subsidence, as if supported by the very waters that should undermine it. I returned home with a growing sense of dread, seeing my beloved cottage through new eyes. The dampness in the corners that never quite dry regardless of heating. The subtle rippling effect in the flagstones of the kitchen floor when viewed in certain lights. The fact that I had been drawn to this specific property among so many others, despite it stretching my budget to breaking point. That night, the rain returned with unprecedented force. A proper autumn storm that lashed against the windows and transformed the gentle stream into a churning torrent. The humming began earlier than usual, dispensing with subtlety now that I had glimpsed the truth. It no longer disguised itself as a lullaby, but revealed its true nature, a hungry, insistent summons. Sleep was an impossibility, so I sat in my study, surrounded by books that no longer offered comfort. Around midnight, I noticed water seeping beneath my study door, not from outside, but from the direction of my bedroom, heart pounding. I opened the door to find the hallway floor covered in a thin sheet of water, its surface unnaturally still despite the slope of the centuries-old floor. My bedroom door stood open, though I distinctly remembered closing it. Light spilled from within, not electric light, but the same pale glow I had glimpsed beneath the stream. The humming had risen to a pitch that vibrated in my chest cavity, in the fluid of my inner ears, in the vitreous humor of my eyes. Some primal instinct of self-preservation kept me from entering my bedroom. Instead, I retreated to the kitchen and found it similarly flooded, water rising impossibly upward from between the flagstones. The stone floor was no longer solid, but seemed to undulate gently, like a membrane stretched over liquid. I fled outside into the storm, rain immediately drenching me as I stumbled down the garden path. I had some half-formed plan to reach my car, to drive to the village, to seek help, but the ground beneath my feet had grown treacherous, mud giving way to something closer to quicksand. Each step became harder than the last, as if the earth itself were liquefying beneath me. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment I saw my cottage transformed. The solid stone walls rippled like the surface of disturbed water. The windows had become membranous, bulging outward with pressure from within, and silhouetted against them, pressing through from the inside, were those same hungry faces I had glimpsed beneath the stream. Dozens of them, their mouths open in that terrible song. The ground gave way beneath me, but instead of sinking into mud, I found myself immersed in water, not falling into a puddle, but rather entering a liquid space that had been masked as solid land. The shock of cold stole my breath as I plunged into this impossible subterranean lake that had disguised itself as my garden. I should have drowned. Perhaps part of me did. What happened next exists in my memory as a series of disjointed impressions rather than a coherent sequence. Pale bodies moving through water, their limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places. A vast underground chamber, its stone ceiling held up by columns of living water that flowed upward against gravity. My cottage above, its foundations not resting on solid ground, but suspended over this flooded underworld by what looked like tendrils of liquid glass. And music, not the luring melody I had heard before, but a complex symphony of water sounds, dripping that foreign percussion, the rush of currents creating wind-like tones, the pressure of depth generating bass notes felt rather than heard, a language of water, ancient and patient. They surrounded me. These beings neither fish nor human, but something that had evolved along a different path entirely. They did not touch me, but their presence encircled me, their communication flowing directly into my mind without passing through my ears. They had been there always, they explained without words. Since before humans built villages along the river, since before Britain rose from prehistoric seas, the surface world was a recent membrane grown across their realm. Occasionally, they reached through, where streams converged, where underground rivers met, where centuries of water pressure created passages between realms. They needed something from us, these water dwellers. Not our bodies, which were useless to them, but our consciousness, specifically consciousness shaped by sleep. In dreams, the human mind generated patterns similar to their thought processes, creating brief moments of compatibility between our species. They harvested these patterns like we might harvest honey from bees, using them to supplement their own awareness. Forest Streams Cottage had been their creation, or rather their adaptation of human architecture, a structure designed to house humans while allowing access to their sleeping minds. The previous occupants hadn't died as humans understand death. They had been gradually absorbed, their conscious patterns integrated into collective awareness of the water dwellers. Mrs. Holloway, who had lived their 60 years, had been their most successful harvest. A lifetime of dreams slowly fed into their collective, culminating in a final, complete absorption that left her physical body empty but smiling, experiencing a form of existence her human mind would interpret as perfect peace. They showed me this not with pride or malice, but with a matter-of-fact directness of creatures explaining natural processes. This was simply how things were, how they had always been. My insomnia was an unexpected complication, a resistance they hadn't encountered before. My mind refusing to generate the dream patterns they needed to harvest, forcing them to attempt more direct communication. As this understanding flowed into me, I became aware of a choice being offered. I could join them willingly, surrendering to the liquid embrace that surrounded me. They offered sleep, true, perfect, eternal sleep suffused with dreams more vivid than any I had experienced. My consciousness would continue, expanded rather than extinguished, experiencing their water world as my new reality while contributing my human perspective to their collective. Or I could return to the surface, to my cottage, to my sleepless existence, knowing what lay beneath, hearing their song each night, until eventually my resistance eroded like stone under constant rainfall. It wasn't a threat. They were incapable of understanding coercion as humans conceive it. It was simply an acknowledgement of inevitable natural processes. I don't remember making a choice. I don't remember how I returned to the surface world. My next clear memory is of waking on the muddy garden path as dawn broke through dissipating storm clouds. My clothes inexplicably dried despite the sodden ground beneath me. The stream had returned to its normal level, innocent and sparkling in the morning light. The cottage appeared unchanged, solid stone walls, tiled roof, windows reflecting the sunrise rather than bulging with otherworldly pressure. When I cautiously entered, I found no sign of flooding. The flagstones in the kitchen lay firm and solid beneath my feet. My bedroom contained nothing but rumpled bedclothes and the scattered academic papers I'd been reviewing before the storm began. I might have dismissed the entire experience as a vivid dream, a hallucination born of extreme sleep deprivation, except for two things. First, my insomnia had vanished. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months, sinking into slumber moments after my head touched the pillow. I dreamed intensely, not nightmares, but complex, vivid landscapes of flowing water and pale movement that I couldn't quite remember upon waking, leaving only a lingering sensation of having visited somewhere profound and ancient. Second, when I resumed work on my folklore manuscript, I found myself writing passages I didn't remember researching, detailed accounts of water entities that existed in the liminal spaces between human perception and understanding, creatures that weren't malevolent in the way of conventional monsters, but simply operated according to different principles of existence, beings that had evolved in a world defined by fluid dynamics rather than solid matter, developing a consciousness as alien to ours, as ours would be to that of insects. I completed the manuscript in a feverish month of writing, sleeping deeply each night and waking refreshed despite dream journeys I could never quite recall. The book was published to academic acclaim, noted for its unique perspective that bridges the gap between symbolic interpretation and the possibility of literal foundations for water mythology. I continue to live in Four Streams Cottage. The stream still flows at the bottom of my garden, innocent in daylight, softly musical at night. When it rains, I sometimes stand at my bedroom window, watching droplets trace patterns on the glass, listening to the gentle percussion on the roof, and underneath it all, barely perceptible, a familiar humming that no longer disturbs my sleep, but welcomes it. A lullaby of falling water that promises dreams beyond human imagination. I sleep very well these days. Too well, perhaps. Sometimes I wake to find my bed sheets inexplicably damp, though there's never any sign of roof leakage. Sometimes I discover myself at the stream's edge at dawn, with no memory of having left my bed. Sometimes I catch my reflection in water, a puddle, or raindrops, even my morning tea, and glimpse something behind my eyes that doesn't quite match the face I've known for 40 years. My academic colleagues have commented on how I've changed since completing my book, how I seem calmer, more focused, yet somehow distant, how my newest research proposals seem to anticipate connections in water, folklore that haven't been documented before. I smile and attribute it to finally getting proper sleep, because that's all it is, surely, just proper sleep, filled with dreams I share with someone, something, some consciousness that mingles with mine during those vulnerable hours of slumber, exchanging perspectives, blending awareness. The rain is falling again tonight, drumming gentle fingers against my roof. The stream will be rising, its voice joining the symphony of water that surrounds this little cottage built where four currents converge. Soon I'll sleep and dream, and perhaps remember a little more of those dreams when I wake. Or perhaps I'll remember a little less of myself. Either way, I no longer fear the lullaby of falling water. We've reached an understanding. The beings beneath the stream and I, a symbiotic relationship. You might say they take only what I can spare each night. Fragments of dreams, portions of consciousness I don't strictly need for daily function. And in return, they share glimpses of their fluid reality, their ancient perspective, their patient plans for a world with boundaries between water and air, between sleeping and waking, between human and other grow ever thinner, like rainfall on a window, traced by fingers from both sides of the glass. So if you find yourself drawn to a cottage near water, particularly one with a history of contented yet oddly peaceful former occupants, listen carefully on rainy nights. If you hear humming beneath the rainfall, a lullaby without words that promises rest for your weary mind, you have a choice to make. You can leave immediately, seeking the solid, dry certainty of urban life far from convergent streams and underground rivers. Many do, or you can stay and sleep and dream of water rising. Dream so beautiful you'll wake smiling, even as you notice the inexplicable dampness of your pillow. Dreams that will gradually become more real than your waking hours, as what sleeps beneath the water mingles with what sleeps within you. I made my choice. Or perhaps it was made for me in that moment beneath the storm when I glimpsed their world and they tasted mine. Either way, I sleep soundly now. The rain is growing heavier. The lullaby calls. It's time to dream again. The first mushroom appeared 3 days after the rain began. I noticed it on my way to the shed. A pale, slender thing pushing up through the waterlogged grass of my back garden. Nothing remarkable. Suffolk had been drenched by nearly constant rainfall for a week, transforming the usually parched summer landscape into a sodden mess. Perfect conditions for fungi. I paid it little mind. Focused instead on retrieving the tar pollen. I needed to cover the leak that had developed in my conservatory roof. By the time I returned from the shed, I'd forgotten about the mushroom entirely. That evening, the rain intensified. I sat in my living room with a glass of whiskey, listening to it hammer against the windows and roof of my isolated cottage. I've always found comfort in such sounds. The percussive rhythm of water droplets, the distant rumble of thunder, the sigh of wind through trees. Especially since Elaine's passing 2 years ago, these natural symphonies had become welcome company in my solitude. The following morning, I noticed 3 more mushrooms had sprouted overnight, forming a rough circle around first. Again, I thought nothing of it. The weather forecast promised another week of unprecedented rainfall. The meteorologists blaming it on climate change and unusual air currents pushed down from the Arctic. The local paper had begun reporting minor flooding in villages closer to the river Stour, but my cottage sat on slightly elevated ground, safe from rising waters if not from the relentless downpour itself. By the 3rd day, the circle in my garden had expanded to include 12 mushrooms, each identical to the first, unnaturally straight, their caps small and white with faint grayish gills underneath. I took a photograph, intending to search online for an identification, but the rural internet connection had faltered in the storm, leaving me disconnected from the digital world. I made a mental note to try again when service returned or to consult my neighbor Jeffrey, an amateur mycologist, once the rain subsided enough for visiting. That night, I dreamed the mushroom circle for the first time. In my dream, I stood in my garden under impossibly clear skies, the grass dry beneath my feet despite the continuing rain in the waking world. The mushrooms glowed with faint bioluminescence, their circle now perfect, each specimen equidistant from its neighbors. As I watched, they began to pulse with light, a rhythmic pattern like a visual heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. In the center of the circle, the grass darkened as if a shadow were being cast upon it. Though I could see no source for such a shadow, the darkness spread outward, approaching the inner edge of the mushroom ring, and I felt an inexplicable dread at the thought of it touching those luminous fungi. I woke suddenly to the sound of thunder directly overhead, my heart racing. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. Rain lashed against my bedroom window with renewed vigor, as if the storm had found a second wind in the darkest hour of night. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. I lay awake, the dream lingering in my thoughts with unusual persistence. When dawn finally arrived, barely distinguishable from night through the gray curtain of rainfall, I found myself drawn immediately to the window that overlooked the back garden. The mushroom circle had expanded again. I counted 24 specimens now, the circle nearly 2 meters in diameter. But what truly unsettled me was their arrangement. A perfect circle, each fungus exactly the same distance from its neighbors, just as in my dream. The mathematical precision seemed impossible for random natural growth. Despite the continuing rain, I pulled on Wellington boots and a waterproof coat, determined to examine the circle more closely. The garden had become a quagmire, my boots sinking inches into the saturated soil with each step. As I approached the ring of mushrooms, I noticed something I hadn't been able to see from the window. grass inside the circle appeared different. Not just wet, but darker, as if it had been stained or dyed. I knelt at the edge of the circle, careful not to disturb any of the fungi, and touched the darkened grass. It felt normal in texture, but left a faint smudge of what looked like black pigment on my fingertips. I rubbed my fingers together, finding the substance oddly viscous, more like oil than mud. It had no discernible odor. A flash of lightning illuminated the garden, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was directly overhead. I retreated to the house, washing the black residue from my fingers with an unusual degree of thoroughness, as if some part of me recognized it as contamination rather than mere dirt. That afternoon, I tried calling Jeffrey, my college's neighbor, but the phone lines had joined the internet in storm-induced failure. The cottage felt increasingly isolated as the world beyond my garden faded into gray sheets of rain. I found myself returning to the window regularly, watching the mushroom circle as if expecting it to do something. Change, move, grow. By evening, it had done all three. The fungi now numbered 36. The circle expanded to nearly 3 meters across. The caps had grown larger and the stalks thicker. Most concerning was the black discoloration inside the ring, which had deepened the color of pitch and now seemed to glisten with an oily sheen even in the dull twilight. I dreamt of the circle again that night. The same perfect round of luminous mushrooms, the same darkness pooling in its center. But this time, the darkness had depth, not a stain but an aperture, a hole extending downward as some of my dreaming mind could not comprehend. From that depth came a sound, barely audible at first, but growing gradually clearer. A wet, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat heard through fluid, like something vast stirring in primordial ooze. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. The same rhythm as the glowing mushrooms. As I stared into that impossible depth, I became aware that something was rising toward the surface. Something that had waited for precisely the right conditions. Endless rain, saturated soil, a perfect circle of it heralds breaking the boundary between worlds. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat rather than rainwater. The storm continued unabated outside, the 10th consecutive day of rainfall. My clock read 3:17 a.m., exactly as it had the previous night, which struck me as odd enough to check my wristwatch for confirmation. It showed the same time. A coincidence, surely, or perhaps a power fluctuation had reset both timepieces. Sleep refused a return. So I made tea and sat in the darkened kitchen, listening to rainfall and trying to convince myself that my dreams were merely stress responses to isolation and the oppressive weather. I'd read somewhere that fungal spores could sometimes contain compounds that affected human neurochemistry when inhaled. Perhaps the mushrooms were a variety with mild psychoactive properties, and my garden inspections had exposed me to their spores. This rational explanation comforted me enough that I managed to doze in my armchair until proper daylight arrived. Though daylight had become a relative term, the heavy cloud cover and constant rain creating a perpetual twilight across the landscape. My first look in the garden confirmed my fears that the rational explanation was insufficient. The mushroom circle had expanded dramatically overnight, now nearly filling the small garden, with a ring approximately 5 meters in diameter. The fungi themselves had grown to monstrous proportions, each nearly 30 centimeters tall with caps like dinner plates. Their color shifted from white to a dusky gray. The black area within the circle had expanded correspondingly, the grass entirely subsumed by what appeared to be a pool of viscous dark liquid that rippled occasionally, though there was no wind to disturb it. I stood transfixed at the window, unease blossoming into genuine fear. This was not natural fungal growth. Nothing in my understanding of biology could explain what I was witnessing. As I watched, one of the oversized mushrooms shifted slightly, not swaying in wind or rain, but actively moving its stalk. bending a few degrees before straightening again. Another followed suit, then another, creating a slow, undulating motion around the circumference of the circle. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. The rhythm for my dream. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave, to get help, to have someone else witness what was happening in my garden. I dressed hurriedly, pulling on the still damp Wellington boots and raincoat from the previous day. As I moved toward the front door, the lights flickered and died. Power cut. Not unexpected given the severity and duration of the storm, but its timing heightened my sense that something deliberate was happening, that the mushroom circle in the darkness it contained were somehow influencing events around me. I fumbled for the torch I kept in the entryway drawer, finding it with shaking hands. Its beam seemed feeble against the unnatural gloom that had descended with the power of failure. I opened the front door to a wall of water, the rain now falling with such intensity that it formed a nearly continuous sheet. I hesitated on the threshold. My car sat in the gravel drive, only 20 meters away, yet nearly invisible through the downpour. To reach Jeffrey's cottage would require a 2-mile drive along country lanes that might already be flooding. The rational choice was to remain indoors, to wait for the storm to abate or for power and communications to be restored. But rationality was rapidly losing ground to primal fear. I could feel the presence of the mushroom circle behind me, through the walls of the cottage, like a physical pressure against my consciousness. Something was happening there, something that responded to the incessant rainfall with unsettling purpose. I closed the front door and moved to the kitchen at the rear of the cottage, where windows overlooked the garden. The scene had changed again in the brief minutes I'd been preparing to leave. The pool of blackness within the mushroom circle now bulged upward in the center, forming a dome-like protrusion that rose toward the rain-filled sky. The fungi themselves had continued to grow, now nearly a meter tall, their caps spreading wider, edges curling upward to reveal gills that no longer appeared gray, but had darkened to the same pitch black as the pool they surrounded. As I watched, frozen in horrified fascination, the central dome pulsed. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. It was growing larger with each pulse, the surface of the black substance stretching like a membrane. Occasionally, the rain would fall differently around it, as if deflected by an invisible barrier extending above the circle. I had the distinct impression that what I was seeing was not growing because of the rain, but rather using the rain, consuming it, incorporating it, transforming it into something else entirely. A sound began to register at the edge of my hearing, a low, wet thrumming that synchronized perfectly with the pulsing of the black dome. Not thunder, not the storm, but something emanating from the circle itself. A vibration I could feel in my chest cavity, in the fluid of my inner ear, in the vitreous humor of my eyes. I backed away from the window, moving through the cottage to the front door once more. Whatever was happening in my garden, I needed to be elsewhere. The risk of flooded roads now seemed insignificant compared to the danger I sensed from the mushroom circle and its black heart. I stepped outside into the torrent, immediately drenched despite my raincoat. The gravel drive had become a shallow stream, water flowing around my ankles as I sloshed toward my car. Each step was laborious, the ground beneath the water soft and yielding, threatening to trap my boots. I was halfway to the car when I noticed something in the flowing water around my feet. Tiny black droplets, beating on the surface like oil but moving against the current, moving toward me. I increased my pace, nearly losing my footing on the submerged gravel. Reaching the car, I fumbled with cold, wet hands to retrieve the keys from my pocket. As I unlocked the door, I glanced back toward the cottage. The black droplets in the water had multiplied, converging around my footprints. As I watched, they began to extend upward, forming miniature versions of the dome in my garden. Tiny black mushroom caps erupted from each, no larger than buttons, but growing visibly even as rain continued to hammer down upon them. I wrenched the car door open and threw myself inside, pulling my feet in quickly as if the spreading blackness might grab at my ankles. The key shook in my hand as I tried to start the engine. Once, twice, on the third attempt it caught, the familiar rumble providing momentary comfort. I switched the headlights on, their beams cutting twin paths through the sheets of rain. In their illumination, I could see that the entire front garden was now dotted with the small black mushrooms, each sprouting from a droplet of the oil-like substance. They seemed to be growing along a trail leading from the back garden, around the side of the cottage, and spreading outward toward the lane. I put the car in reverse, tires spinning briefly before finding purchase on the gravel beneath the flowing water. As I backed slowly toward the lane, movement at the cottage caught my attention. Something was emerging from around the side of the building, from the direction of the mushroom circle. At first, I thought it was a person, a figure of approximately human height and proportion. But as it moved fully into the illumination of my headlights, I saw that it was composed entirely of the black, oil-like substance. It had no features, no clothing, no definite outline. Its form constantly shifting like a liquid sculpture held together by an invisible membrane where it touched the ground. Small mushrooms sprouted in its footprints, identical to those I'd seen earlier. I slammed the car into drive and accelerated onto the lane, tires fighting for traction on the flooded surface. Through my rear-view mirror, I saw the figure stand motionless in my driveway, its featureless head oriented toward my retreating vehicle. It made no attempt to pursue, which somehow frightened me more than if it had given chase, as if it knew escape was impossible, as if it had all the time in the world. The drive to Jeffrey's cottage was a nightmare of near-zero visibility and partially flooded roads. Twice I nearly slid into ditches, and once I had to reverse and find an alternate route when I encountered a section of lane completely submerged. The entire journey of 2 miles took nearly 40 minutes of white-knuckle driving. Jeffrey's cottage appeared as a dim outline through the rain, no lights visible within. I pulled into his drive and honked the horn repeatedly, unwilling to exit the relative safety of my vehicle until I knew someone would answer the door. After several minutes with no response, desperation drove me outside. The rain continued unabated, soaking me instantly as I splashed toward Jeffrey's front door. I pounded on it, calling his name, pressing my face against the adjacent window to peer inside. The cottage was dark and still. I tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Unusual for cautious Jeffrey, but perhaps he'd been evacuated due to flood warnings. I entered, calling out again but receiving no answer. The cottage felt cold and damp, as if it had been empty for some time. I moved through the ground floor rooms, finding nothing amiss but no sign of recent habitation either. The power was out here too, leaving me dependent on my increasingly feeble torch. In Jeffrey's study, I found his collection of mycology books and grabbed the most comprehensive-looking volume. If I couldn't consult Jeffrey directly, perhaps his reference materials could help me identify what was growing in my garden, though I already suspected it was something beyond conventional mycological classification. As I turned to leave, my torch beam caught something on Jeffrey's desk that stopped me cold. A notebook lay open, showing a rough sketch of a circular arrangement of mushrooms. The handwriting beneath was Jeffrey's distinctive scrawl. 3rd day of continuous rain. Unusual fungal growth in garden. Perfect circle, rapid growth rate. Species doesn't match any known local varieties. Taking spore samples tomorrow if rain subsides. The date at the top of the page was from 2 weeks ago. I flipped through the subsequent pages with growing dread. Jeffrey had documented the same progression I'd witnessed in my own garden. The expanding circle, the darkening center, the accelerated growth during rainfall. His final entry Dated 3 days prior, simply read, "Rain continues. Circle complete. Something moving at the center. Must investigate closer." The empty cottage suddenly felt less like an absence and more like a crime scene. I backed away from the desk, the mycology book clutched forgotten in my hand. My torch beam swung wildly around the room as panic took hold. Finally settling on a window that overlooked Jeffrey's back garden, I approached slowly, already knowing what I would see. A perfect circle of massive gray mushrooms, surrounding a pool of black that bulged upward in the center, pulsing rhythmically under the endless rain. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. But Jeffrey's circle was further developed than mine. The central dome had split open at the top, revealing a vertical aperture like a mouth or a wound. And gathered around this opening were 3 featureless figures composed of the same black substance, one of which I somehow knew had been Jeffrey. I fled the cottage, dropping the mycology book in my haste. The rain had intensified yet again, now falling with such force that it stung my exposed skin. I scrambled into my car and reversed out the drive, no destination in mind beyond a way. The nearest proper town was Sudbury, about 7 miles distant. I headed in that direction, though the flooding had worsened noticeably in the short time I'd spent in Jeffrey's cottage. My headlights revealed standing water across much of the road, forcing me to reduce speed to avoid hydroplaning. My mind raced alongside the car, trying to process what I'd seen. The identical mushroom circles, the black, oil-like substance, the featureless figures, the rhythmic pulsing that matched the tempo of my dreams. It suggested coordination, communication, intent. Not random fungal growth, but something organized, something purposeful, something that used the rain. I was so absorbed in these thoughts that I nearly missed a roadblock ahead. A police vehicle with flashing lights positioned across the lane. I braked carefully, coming to a stop several meters from the barrier. An officer approached, rain streaming off his high-visibility jacket. "Roads closed ahead," he shouted over the downpour as I lowered my window. "Major flooding in Sudbury. We're evacuating the low-lying areas." "I need to get through," I said, hearing the edge of panic in my voice. "There's something happening. Something in the gardens. Mushroom circles. Black creatures." The officer's expression shifted from professional concern to wary assessment. "Sir, have you been drinking? Or take any substances?" "No. I'm trying to tell you there's a serious situation. My neighbor Jeffrey is missing. There's something growing that's changing people." "Right," the officer said, clearly humoring me. "Why don't you turn around and head back home? Wait out the storm there. Or, if you're concerned about flooding, we've set up an emergency shelter at the primary school in Long Melford." He pointed to a side road. "You can take this diversion." I realized how I must sound, a wild-eyed man ranting about mushroom circles and black creatures during a natural disaster. The officer was already dealing with a genuine emergency in the flooding. He had no capacity to entertain what sounded like hallucinations or paranoia. "The shelter," I said finally. "I'll go to the shelter." He nodded, stepping back from my car. "Drive carefully. Water's deep in places." I followed the diversion route, but as soon as the police vehicle was out of sight in my rear view mirror, I pulled over. The shelter would be no safer than anywhere else if what I'd seen at my cottage and Jeffrey's was spreading, wherever there was rain, and it was everywhere now. The mushroom circles could form, and this storm showed no signs of abating. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I retrieved my phone, hoping against hope that I might find a signal despite the continuing communications disruptions. To my surprise, I had a single bar of service, weak but present. I searched for information on mushroom circles, finding mostly benign references to fairy rings and mundane fungal growth patterns. Nothing that matched the accelerated development or the black substance I'd witnessed. I tried adding terms like black center and rain activated, but still found nothing relevant. On impulse, I searched for news about the current storm. Most reports focus on the flooding and emergency responses, but one small article from 3 days ago caught my attention. It referenced a meteorite that had been observed breaking up over East Anglia shortly before the rain began, with fragments potentially landing in rural Suffolk. The article was speculative, questioning whether there could be any connection between the meteorite and the unusual weather pattern that followed. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with my rain-soaked clothing. The timing aligned perfectly. The meteorite fragments fall into Earth, then the unprecedented rainfall, then the appearance of the first mushroom in my garden. Not mushrooms at all, perhaps, but something else. Something that used fungi as a familiar template, but was fundamentally different. Something from elsewhere. I thought of the black figures I'd seen. Jeffrey and whoever else had been transformed. Not killed, not replaced, but incorporated, converted into components of whatever was emerging from the circles, and spreading with each raindrop that carried particles of that black, oil-like substance. The realization struck me with horrible clarity. I hadn't escaped. By fleeing my cottage, by visiting Jeffrey's, by driving to floodwaters, I'd done exactly what it wanted. I'd helped it spread. I looked down at my clothes, still damp from the rain, and noticed for the first time tiny black specks on the fabric. Not mud or dirt, but perfectly round droplets that beaded on the surface like oil. As I watched, one of them twitched slightly, then extended a microscopic filament upward. 1, 2, 3. Pause. I tore off my raincoat, throwing it onto the passenger seat. My shirt beneath showed the same black specks. My hands, when I examined them in the dim light, were similarly marked. The thing from a mushroom circle was already on me, in me, beginning its conversion process molecule by molecule. I stared out at the rain still hammering down on the car roof, on the flooded road, on the saturated fields, spreading the black oil substance across the countryside droplet by droplet, creating new circles wherever it landed, growing, converting, expanding with each pulse. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. The rhythm was in my head now, synchronizing with my heartbeat. I could feel the first changes beginning inside me, subtle alterations in perception, in the way my thoughts formed, the boundaries of my consciousness stretching outward, touching something vast and patient and utterly alien that waited just beyond the veil of normal reality. It had been waiting for so long, for the perfect confluence of conditions. The right spores carried to Earth on a fragmenting meteorite, the right weather pattern to distribute them, the right soil conditions to nurture their growth. A cosmic accident that, once set in motion, proceeded with the implacable purpose of all successful biological invasions. I should warn someone, try to call the police again, or drive to the emergency shelter with my terrible knowledge. But the impulse felt increasingly distant, overwritten by new imperatives emerging from the changes spreading through my system. I restarted the car and turned back toward my cottage, toward the circle in my garden with its pulsing black heart, not because I wanted to escape it anymore, but because I was becoming part of it, a node in its expanding network, a cell in its developing organism. The rain continues to fall as I write this. It hasn't stopped for 17 days now, according to the emergency broadcast that occasionally breaks through on the car radio. Flooding is described as catastrophic across southern England. People are being evacuated from coastal areas, moved to higher ground, concentrated in emergency shelters, concentrated together. In the rain, I'm parked on a hill overlooking the valley where my cottage sits. From here, I can see the changes in the landscape that no emergency broadcast mentions. The perfect black circles that, the countryside, growing larger by the hour, the dark figures that move between them with increasing purpose, no longer confined to gardens but spreading across fields and roads. The larger structures beginning to form where multiple circles have merged, conical protrusions rising toward the rain-filled sky, pulsing in perfect synchronization. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. My transformation is nearly complete. The black substance has infiltrated most of my tissues now, converting them cell by cell into something new, something that understands the true purpose of the circles and the rain and the rhythm, something that recognizes this not as an ending, but as a magnificent beginning. Soon, I will leave my car and walk down to join my fellows in the work of conversion. Jeffrey is there, and others from nearby cottages and farms. Together, we are building something beautiful in the rain. But I wanted to leave this account, typed with fingers that are less and less my own, on a phone that will soon be encased in the same black substance that now comprises most of my body, a message in a digital bottle, cast into the electronic ocean. The rain will continue. The circles will spread. The rhythm will synchronize across continents. 1, 2, 3, pause. It is a heartbeat, the awakening pulse of something vast that slumbered between the stars until a fragment found its way to our blue planet, so perfectly suited to its needs, so wonderfully wet. If you're reading this, it may already be too late for your region, but perhaps you live somewhere dry. Perhaps you have time to seek the desert, the mountains, anywhere the rain cannot reach. Or perhaps you'll step outside, turn your face to the cleansing rain, and allow yourself to be gently unmade and remade, to become part of something greater than your small, solid, separate self could ever comprehend. The black droplets that were once my tears are falling onto the screen as I type these final words. They're forming tiny mushroom caps already, perfect miniature versions of the heralds that announce this glorious transformation. What grows after the rain isn't just mushrooms. It's us. It's the new us. And we are magnificent.